Welcome to the NonSequitur Show. Continual watching beyond this point may result in terminal face palming and a complete loss of wokeness. You have been warned.
All right, everyone. Hey, welcome. It has been a day since I've actually done an actual non-sequitur show, and this one's going to be a little bit different than some other stuff. It's actually going to be a presentation, a pretty extensive one. I've kind of looked through it, and it's way beyond my pay grade, but I do find it absolutely fascinating. So I have Dr. Gary Loechelt back, if you guys remember. He and Dr. Kevin Hinkey, who's out there in the live chat, I see him out there, came on before to talk about helium diffusion rates, which we're not going to dive into today, but maybe we'll do a follow-up another time. But he has put together a brilliant, I guess, a Precambrian flood, mountains of evidence, he called it, against the failures of flood geology. So I'm just going to kind of turn it right over to him so he can start the presentation in his own time and introduce himself again to the audience who may not know who he is, but you should, and we can go from there. So, hey, Gary, welcome back. Gary, you there?
Yeah. Sorry. I was hearing a double audio. Okay. I was hearing two audio feeds with a delay, so it was like an echo. So yes. So thank you, Steve. I always appreciate being on your show. It is a privilege. I think you're doing a great service to the community by providing a forum to talk about things that would be hard to find a place to talk about in more conventional venues. And like Steve said, my name is Dr. Gary Loechelt. My PhD is actually in a material science program, and my employment is in the area of semiconductor electronics. So you might ask, why is this person talking about geology? Because I'm not a geologist by training, but I am an educated scientist, and geology is a hobby, and really what got me interested in geology is the topic that we're talking about today. And so a couple things. I think what I was trying to achieve was to answer a scientific question by direct evidence and not letting lack of a formal training in the subject get in my way, because I believe that anyone who is willing to learn and have an open mind can master things. It doesn't require a college degree. So should we
yeah, no, I love that intro. Thank you for the kind words, and I do what I can. But I think you are actually well versed in a lot of different subjects. So I think this is kind of more up your alley than people may think. So I am showing the beginning of the slide presentation. So just take it away, and I will control the slides for you, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Precambrian. That's the next slide. Yeah. So what is the Precambrian? And you can see a chart on the left, and it shows different geologic eras. The top part is what's called the Phanerozoic, and it's what we typically think about when we think about fossils and dinosaurs and things like that. You can see Mesozoic, age of the dinosaurs. So a lot of times when we think about stratified rock, and Grand Canyon's a great example, a lot of that is in the Phanerozoic. But if you look at the time scale, at least the conventional time scale, that only goes back a little bit over 500 million years, which means there's another 4 billion years or so of Earth history before that. And so that's what the Precambrian is. It's an informal term, but it does describe a fairly large time span from essentially the start of the planet up until 400 or 541 million years ago. And the boundary is marked by when we start seeing fossils. Let's describe fossils suitable for systematic biostratic correlation. So that begins in the Cambrian. So it's a huge chunk of time in Earth's history. Okay, that's just some background. And let's talk about something else called the Great Unconformity. You have that. Next slide, yeah.
Next slide, okay.
Next slide. So this is a well-known term, especially in Arizona. In fact, Arizona made it famous. It was Powell's river expedition on the Colorado, where he documented the geology along the river and noticed what he called a great unconformity. And it describes the contact layer below the Tonto group, which is the horizontal stratified layers in the canyon, over Vishnu basement rock. And again, from conventional time measurement, that's a time span of about 1.2 billion years that is missing. So no rock record. You have this 1.8 billion year old Vishnu schist, and on top of that, 500 or 600 million old the tape heap sandstone. So if you look at the time chart on the left, I depicted that pictorially. Yeah, you can see. You see let's start at the top, Steve. Point to the Paleozoic.
Okay, let me. I don't have my mouse on there. I can. Let me switch that. And if you want the mouse, I usually take it off. But let me see if I can take it off here.
Describe it while you're doing that.
Here we go.
So you see two areas in white. You see what's called the Paleozoic.
Sorry. Here we go.
You see the Paleozoic there, and that time span pretty much encompasses most of the famous stratified layers in the Grand Canyon, from the bottom to the top. But when you go to the very bottom of the canyon, the inner gorge, it's much older rock. And that great unconformity represents a time span where there is no record of rocks there. And it's a missing period of time of about 1.2 billion years. So that's a big chunk of time where there's no rock record. And you can see the insert on the right, a nice picture of it. Yeah, right there. There's a thin white line, if you can see it, right there, you got it. That marks the unconformity. You have this schist below it, and then you have sandstone above it. And a pretty
so
sharp.
The unconformity is literally that boundary layer right there.
Yeah, that white line is it, exactly. Okay. So, missing time at the Grand Canyon. And now to go to the next slide, let's talk about how that is interpreted. And there are two different interpretations. Well, probably more, but primarily we're going to talk about two opposing worldviews. One is the view of mainstream science, which is what I just presented, and that is that unconformity, that line, represents a gap in the rock record of about 1.2 billion years. And you can see Mr. Rainey there on the left, and the shorts, and he's actually pointing to it. You can see where his left hand is pointing right below the unconformity, and then his right hand is resting on the first.
I didn't mean to right here. Yeah, right here. So this layer right here, this section right here would be the unconformity.
It's actually where his index finger is pointing.
Right there.
It's actually that precise.
Okay. Right there.
Yeah,
okay.
that precise, because his right hand is actually on one of the first layers of the tape heap sandstone. So it is that distinct. I mean, he is pointing to it with his index finger.
Got it.
Right there.
Right there. Yep.
Right there. Yeah. So I mean, it's a very sharp demarcation, very abrupt change in rock type and everything. Fossils, that's every measure.
So it's
So
a completely different type of stone from here to here. I mean, this is.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a sedimentary rock above it, and
Right
it's
here.
a metamorphic rock below it.
Hang on.
Yeah.
So right here, this is sedimentary. This is metamorphic.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So on the right, there's a very different interpretation, and this is from Young Earth Creationists, and it's a picture from one of their frequent tours down the Colorado River, and it's more of a pan out shot. But you see the guy sort of standing, right there. That's Andrew Snelling. And
really?
Okay. I think so.
Why
was so
laugh,
funny?
That is funny. It's not surprising. Is this not surprising?
Well, I mean, if you read the caption there,
I can see it now under here. I didn't.
Geologist
read it
Andrew Snelling explains. Well, what he's basically saying, no, there's not 1.2 billion years of missing time. There can't be, because the Earth is only 6,000 years old from their point of view. Therefore, they have to find an alternate explanation, and they invoke the flood as being the explanation for pretty much all of the features you see in geology. So their explanation is, no, this is not representing a large period of missing time. You have an Earth that's only 6,000 years old. The flood came along and basically scoured off the surface of the pre-existing landscape, and then began to rapidly deposit the layers of rock that you see above it. And so his interpretation is that he's standing on rock that was created during creation week 6,000 years ago, and he is touching sediments that were deposited during Noah's flood about 4,000 years ago. And the unconformity really represents practically no gap in time. I mean, it's just from the beginning of the flood, from the very onset of the flood to maybe a few days or a week or two into the flood.
Is he saying that everything above this is from the flood? Is this post flood?
Yes.
Everything? Okay, so all this layer.
Yeah, layers. And well above that. I mean,
okay.
This is the Grand Canyon. I mean, you're talking about thousands of feet of sediments above that. But he's saying this is where the flood started.
This is where the flood started. So he thinks that this is, let's say, 6,000 years ago, give or take. 5,000. How many was it?
Well, the flood would have been 4,000.
4,000 BC, right?
Or 4,500. Yeah.
Okay, so that's 6,000 years ago. So all this was after that, according to the model. Okay.
Yeah. So he believes he's standing right there on rock that was created during creation week, and he's touching rock that was deposited during Noah's flood, and that gap there represents basically where the flood started. So you could just put an arrow there, flood starts here.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, do you want me to read what's underneath there? Because it might be hard for the audience. Or is there any, because I just put this out myself.
Go ahead and read that. Yeah, that might be helpful. I can't read it. But
I can't read it either. That's why I didn't realize. But I can barely make it out. But it says, a highlight of the trip came on day 6. Geologist Andrew Snelling explained how the destructive waters of the flood sheared off the Earth's surface and then deposited horizontal layers on top. Here in Blacktail Canyon, he could stand on rocks from creation week and then touch the first deposits laid down during the flood. This contact line between the pre-flood rocks and flood deposits is known as the Great Unconformity, a sober reminder that God judges.
Yeah. Okay. So that's his view. And I think now is our little video clip from Dr. Clary.
Okay, let me see. I think I can play that. Okay, so Gary's not gonna be able to see the video, but you guys on the outside should. So let me know if it comes out okay.
Okay. So the flood answers it.
The flood's the best explanation for what we see. It's just people don't want to think about it. The geologists, the uniformitarianists, the whole idea is starting with Hutton, and many of the 19th century geologists started pushing the Bible out. Mm-hmm. Trying to separate the Bible from science. And in fact, the Bible and science actually match up perfectly when they look at the data. And just look at the data, not an interpretation of the data, but the actual data itself does support a young Earth with one major period of massive deposition and then massive erosion as the water went up and as the water went down.
Okay.
All right. So he was basically talking about deposition layers.
Yeah, and let me just read what I call the key quote from this clip, and that is Dr. Clary believes that the flood is the best explanation for what we see, with one major period of massive deposition followed by massive erosion as the water went up and the water went down. So basically, he is saying that most of what we see in geology can be explained by one major event called the flood. And you had, well, of course, this initial erosion of the landscape followed by massive deposition and massive erosion. Okay.
And this
So,
happened.
but the key,
It's happened over a year. Dr. Hinckley was in live chat, and he's
yeah,
saying that supposedly, and I think he's absolutely right, that they're saying that basically the flood lasted 1 year, and over a period of 1 year, that's when you get these sedimentation layers from deposition and erosion, like back and forth.
correct.
Okay.
It's all fits in the span of 1 year.
Okay.
And he believes most of the things we observe in geology are derived from that one event, and that it took 1 year, massive deposition followed by massive erosion. But keep that in mind. That's going to be a theme through this talk. One event where all the deposition and all the erosion happened in that one event.
Got it.
Because that's a claim. That's a hypothesis. That is something you can test.
It's absolutely a
Does
testable
rock
claim.
record?
You could
Yeah,
test and
go
see
ahead,
if that's
continue.
even possible in the lab,
Yeah.
couldn't you?
Well, or in the field.
Would it be just in the field? I mean, could you actually do testing to see if sedimentation rates would lay down something like this? I mean, it just doesn't seem plausible for 1 year to lay down that much.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways you can approach it, but I wanted to keep this particular thing just very, very empirical as far as just observationally. What do we see in the field?
Got it.
And can we describe what we see in the field with this paradigm? We're given a paradigm to interpret the rocks we see, and that is there's one major event, and that major event encompassed a period of massive deposition followed by massive erosion, but one major event. That's the paradigm. Now let's look at the field, and this is where we're going. Let's look at the field and see if that paradigm really describes what we see and helps us interpret what we see.
Okay, next slide.
Yeah. So this one, well, that's clear. One more, please.
Yeah, I played that one.
Let's go to the. So I do say this because I'm a Christian, but I do get criticized, I think, for some of the stands I take on this issue, because some Christians think that because I criticize flood geology, I'm criticizing the Bible. And the whole point of this slide is to point out, no. You can logically make a distinction between the two. And to illustrate that, I just have two quotes there. One is from the Bible itself, and this is the flood story, and it's short enough I can just read it. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heavens were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, all that was on dry land died. Okay, so that's the Bible account. Now, on the right is the interpretation of young earth creationist Larry Vardaman. So this is his take on the flood. Okay, and I'll start with the yellow words. The world immediately after the Genesis flood was considerably different than it is today. The crust of the earth was ripped apart, continents moved around, hot magma spewed into the ocean, water inundated the entire globe, sediment was deposited over most of the land, volcanoes threw ash into the air, mountains rose to the sky, land animals died, forests were destroyed, much of the ocean life was killed, and heat and salt were added to the ocean. The flood was so catastrophic that it took hundreds of years for geologic, climatic, and biological conditions to develop a new equilibrium. and that's Larry Vardaman tracking those incredible hypercanes, which in his view were the super duper massive hurricanes that ravaged the earth after the flood, because the flood had heated the ocean so much that you had enhanced hurricane activity. And just to illustrate the words in yellow, I find no support in the text on the left. The words in black, you find some support in the text on the left. So how much of flood geology is biblical? I mean, I just want to lay that out there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I say this for the people who will criticize me on biblical grounds, saying I'm attacking the Bible, and I'm saying, no, I'm not attacking the Bible.
They're two different things.
Yeah. Do you see the difference?
Yeah,
I know you're not a Christian, but you get the argument.
I do, and I think it's unfair to criticize somebody's Christianic beliefs. As a the science and religion, people can reconcile the two. That's great, but just because you criticize the science doesn't have anything to do with the theology itself. And by the way, I do have a hydrologist in the live chat, Tim. I hope I pronounced his last name, Hebel. But Tim is I know is a hydrologist, and he says Clary actually compresses most flood deposition into the first 150 days of the flood. So basically half the time. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's you have a year to work with, but it's all depends on how you want to allocate that as far as things. But so you get the point that I think people that disagreeing with what is presented by flood geologists doesn't necessarily mean you're questioning the Bible. In fact, I see very little biblical basis for what they promote.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, I'm
okay.
just fine with
that. Okay. I can say more, but if that's good enough, we can probably.
I think the audience gets it. Because we have everything that ranges from atheists to fundamental Christians, and so I think a lot of them are just more interested to see the dichotomy between somebody who's actually presenting the actual science as understood in science, as opposed to what you would find from the younger creationists who kind of put forth their own hypothesis, their own narrative, their own spin, and essentially in their worldview, in which if the science disagrees with the religious beliefs that they have, it's the science that has to be wrong, not the religion. And I think that's a very poor way of doing science. I mean, if a scientist has religion and they have faith and they find something that is different from what they would understand in the science, a good scientist is going to be able to reconcile that without just throwing away the science, prima facie. And that's what happens in the young Earth creationist movement, is they have to put that young Earth first above everything else. It's almost like they worship young Earth creationism more than they would Jesus or something. And I don't mean to be flippant, but it really does, because they put that first. Does that make sense?
I mean, it almost borderlines on blasphemy from my point of view. But I'll read this quote from St. Augustine. I mean, so this is 1,500 years ago, but I think he is so eloquent, and coming from such a prestigious Christian figure, historical figure, it carries, I think, both historical and theological weight. But this is what he says, and it touches on what you said. Usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of the world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the year and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics, and we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation. That's Augustine. That's 1,500 years ago.
Yeah, that's quite some time ago. Probably so.
But he's acknowledging that non-Christians know there is truth. He's basically acknowledging there is truth in science apart from religion that you can know just based upon reason and experience.
Yeah,
And
I think
you
he's right.
know truth there. I mean, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
And he says it's disgraceful if someone who claims to be a Christian speaks nonsense and says, "Well, this is what the Bible says," and Augustine basically says, "No, no, we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation." And I won't read the rest of it, but his basic point is the problem is people will think, well, if the Bible teaches that, then the Bible's nonsense. And Augustine's saying, no, that's the danger, is you miss the real message of the Bible because people get hung up over something that is nonsense. Anyway,
All right. Yep.
so I think that's enough here, but I had to make that point for a number of reasons. But let's talk about the science. So let's go to the next slide. There. Okay. So we have this hypothesis. Andrew Snelling basically said that this great unconformity was evidence of the beginning of the flood, that the flood initially scoured off the creation week landscape and then began to deposit the sediments. Clary, his wording is that you have a major event that was massive deposition of sediments followed by massive erosion. Now, at first glance, the young Earth's position, they do raise a good question. I mean, you saw that picture of Rainey with his index finger pointing to this boundary and saying, well, there's over 1 billion years of Earth history that's just gone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good question. How do we really know that it even existed, right? You're just saying it's gone. Well, where is your evidence of it being there? So when this was about 8 years ago when I started to think about this, and I thought, there's an interesting way, a very simple way to test this hypothesis, because the argument is based around this missing layer of rock, which that unconformity really represents a missing piece of Earth history. And my hypothesis was, what if we could find rocks in that gap? And you can see in the picture on the right where the unconformity was on prior slides. I made that white and I said, well, let's look for rocks. Now, this is experimental. This is observational science. Let's go out in the field and try and look for these rocks.
You're making a prediction and then you're testing it by going in the field and observing it, or trying to observe it.
And so that's how the scientific method works. And also along those lines, Steve, to point out, sometimes young Earth creationists make this argument that they distinguish between what they call operational science and historical science. Being observational science is something we can repeat in the lab and therefore it's testable, but historical science deals with the past, what happened in the past, and because we can't replicate the past, we can't subject it to formal hypothesis testing. And I disagree with that, because even though we can't replicate the past, we haven't observed everything there is to observe. So you can make a hypothesis on things that happened in the past but have not yet been observed, and then go and look for it, which is why we have telescopes and microscopes and other tools. It's to expand what we see. So you can test hypothesis on events of the past that you have not yet observed evidence of what happened, and make predictions on what you might see if you could have those observations.
Yeah, I think that's the whole point of science. We observe things today, then we hypothesize why we're observing the things that we observe in modernity. I mean, everything takes time to observe anything. Light takes, a finite time to reach our eyes anyway, so we're always looking in the past. But the whole point is to say, okay, this is what we're seeing. Like if we look at the cosmic microwave background radiation, okay, what explains this? Oh, we've got Big Bang. So that's how science works. And so I see no difference between that and basically what you're doing as far as, your hypothesis of where would we find these rocks at? Where would we find these missing rock layers?
Yeah. And so here's my hypothesis, or actually I have two hypotheses. If the conventional view of science is correct, what would we find? Well, we should find, we should continue to find rocks. And they should not be really all that different than the Paleozoic rocks, except that they will not have abundant macrofossils, because that is sort of what defines this Precambrian versus Cambrian, or Panozoic. the presence of fossils is the defining thing. So by definition, the Precambrian, you won't find fossils, major fossils there, because that's what defines the Precambrian. But aside from that, you should be able to find just about any other kind of rock that you see otherwise, because there's nothing really all that different. And this kind of uniformitarian, right? That what we've seen, throughout Earth's history, we should be able to see some of those same processes occur again. But let's take the young Earth interpretation. What would you expect to find? Well, we shouldn't find much of anything. And whatever we find really would just date back to creation week, day 3. We shouldn't find many rocks at all. And what we do find should not look like flood rocks. Because remember, Clary said one major event, massive deposition followed by massive erosion. And this is before that event. So if it's before that event, we're not going to see deposition. We're not going to see massive erosion. It's before that event. You'll just see something that was a relic from creation, but it's not going to be anything like the flood. Okay? And in particular, because Clary talks about deposition of sediments, which what we see today as sedimentary rock, we shouldn't find a lot of sedimentary rock in the Precambrian, because there's no mechanism to provide sedimentary rock. However, from the mainstream point of view, there's no reason why there wouldn't be sedimentary rock. So what we're doing is we're going to look for rocks. We're going to look for rocks in the Precambrian, and we're going to pay close attention to anything that looks sedimentary in origin, okay?
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, next slide. Let's have fun. Okay, so ready for an adventure? This is my Jeep. And I bought it 8 years ago. And in fact, I consider myself an amateur geologist. I've studied it pretty intensely in my spare time for the last 8 years. But really, it was this question that kind of intrigued me to the point where I wanted to do this. And basically, I just got hooked. I long after I'd answered my question enough to my satisfaction, I just had fun doing it. So I just kept doing it. But so everything, pretty much everything in the following slides is personal observation, my own photographs, nothing really taken from the internet. It's not like I've spent hours and hours cruising the internet, pulling pictures from all over the place. I mean, this is firsthand observation and my own work, okay?
I know this is Arizona, but I got to tell you, this literally looks like my backyard that I had when I was living in Sun City. I mean, the motif is pretty much the same of the desert landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, you recognize it.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know you lived in Sun City. Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. the desert. This is what the desert looks like, guys. I mean, this is desert, high desert. But
yeah.
Is this high desert? It is, right?
It's high desert. Yeah. You're starting to. You can see no saguaros or anything. You can see in the back the prickly pear. So that's your more cold hardy, cactus, and you're starting to see the junipers coming in. So it's transitioning from high desert into chaparral, but yeah, still would be technically high desert.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just to give you an idea of where we're going, you can see the map of Arizona on the left there. And do the animations work? If you click one more time, does it give
if I do, yeah, if I click it, it's going to animate, I think. You want me to click?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. So that's the stars where I live in Tempe, and the black box is going to be the study area. And we'll blow that up in the next animation. So there's a shot, Google Maps. So the blue circles, the little tags or flags, I guess, those are all places that I have visited, and I've collected rock samples. So that gives you some idea of the area I've covered. And I've done things outside of that area, but this has been my primary area of interest. So it gives you an idea of some pretty good coverage of this region just northeast of the Phoenix metropolitan area. And we're going to talk about 4 areas in particular. The first one is the Sierra Ancha. Thank you. You anticipate that. So that's a high mountain area north of Lake Roosevelt, which is right below it. That's our big reservoir. And then the next click, you'll see white ledges. That's along the Salt River Canyon. Go one more, we'll see the Monumental Mountains. That's more to the northwest of that area. Then the next one is Tonto Basin. And then finally, East Verde River. Yeah. So that gives you the this is our itinerary. This is where we're going. Okay?
Are these I have to ask, are these similar in time zones as far as geological time zones? Like
No.
No. So White Ledges is going to be a little different than the Tonto Basin.
Yeah. We're going to go through things top down geologically. So we're going to start with the youngest. This is going to be a top down kind of presentation. Yeah, and then just to let you know, this is part of the transition zone between the Colorado Plateau and the basin and range. But we're going top down. So we're going to start with the youngest rocks and end with the oldest at the bottom. Okay.
Okay.
And by the way, when I say that I'm trying to keep this very observation based, meaning I don't want to get into the dating methods because that's a whole topic in itself. So I'm not going to, even though there is some information there on the conventional dates, I'm not going to rely upon that. I'm going to rely purely on stratigraphic relationships and cross-cutting relationships because those set a relative time scale that even younger creationists will not dispute that. They will, the younger creationists will look at this and say, I don't care what date you put on the rock. The Sierra Ancha and those formations are above what you find in the Tonto Basin.
Yeah, dating methods would take us into a whole different direction. That would
but my point is, a young Earth creationist is not going to argue against the stratigraphic.
Yeah, so far this is going to be similar to what they would agree with so far. I mean, their interpretation is different, but so far this is not what I consider can be contentious stuff so far.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And I'm trying to avoid arguing about any peripheral thing and just focus on things that both sides would agree upon. Okay. So let's start with the East Verde River. I think that's the next slide. Go ahead and advance. Yeah. So here, first thing I want to do is just confirm what's been reported. I mean, I talked about the great unconformity and showed pictures from the Grand Canyon. Well, I've not been to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. One day I'd like to, but next best thing, I went to Payson. And the East Verde River, you can see here an excellent example of this unconformity. The tannish, the light tan rock on the top, that's the tape-heat sandstone. And if you look underneath, the darker rock below, yeah, that's Precambrian granite. And you can see there's a pretty sharp line that divides them. And that, yeah, right there. That's the great unconformity right there. So that's about a billion years of missing time, according to conventional geology, right?
So there really should be there should be rocks between here and here, according to
well,
what's actually missing from here to here? Like what is the thing that you would expect or think that you should have between the granite here and the rock here?
Well, let's go to the next slide. That's the whole point. So Steve, you're anticipating things.
Sorry,
that question,
I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll just step back.
No, that's great. No, I'm glad you asked that because, quite honestly, that helps me explain things. Answering that question really is what this entire presentation is about. What would you expect to find there? Well, we're going to find out. And we do that just by going to different locations because, see, that's the thing that's misleading when you point to the great unconformity. You say, well, there's a billion years of Earth history that's missing. You have to qualify that as a billion years worth of Earth history missing at that point. Not necessarily all over the world, but at that point. Go to a different location because you'll find, or you have the opportunity to find, a different type of rock. So that's going to be our strategy. It's like, yes, at this point, in this particular location, there is no record of those rocks. But that doesn't mean there's no record of those rocks anywhere. It just means that location.
Exactly.
Hence why I have the Jeep. That's the whole point of the Jeep,
the
right?
Locations where you do see them, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll start here, and this is Aztec Peak. This is at the very top of the Sierra Ancha Mountains, and you can see on the left there. Here's our tape heat sandstone. capping the top of the mountain, right there. The same type of rock. But if you go to the picture on the right, the little insert, this is quartzite. It's not granite. It's not metamorphic. Well, I mean, it's mildly metamorphic, but it's not like schist or a gneiss or a highly altered form of rock. It's not igneous. It is primarily a quartz, a slightly metamorphized quartz sandstone. So it's a very different kind of rock. And disclaimer at the bottom, for the geologists among us, I'm going to use some of these terms more in the vernacular sense, not in their strict geological sense, because a granite to most people is not necessarily what a geologist.
I think geologists tend to be loose in their language a little bit when they're naming.
Yeah,
this stuff.
I'm not going to go into the whole naming thing. I have some opinions, but I don't want to.
I've looked into that before, and I'm like, I'm not going to get how the names and the specific nature of the rocks that they're going to call this and that, and
yeah. But I'll just say, for simplicity, I'm using things more loosely. And, there's a place for precise vocabulary, but
I agree.
For the sake of the argument of this presentation, whether it's a quartzite or a sedimentary quartz sandstone, doesn't really change the essence of the argument.
Right.
So just to prove, so we don't get bogged down in terminology, I'm just trying to keep things simple.
Absolutely. I think that's good for this presentation.
For the spirit of it. But this is intriguing in itself, because we're seeing sedimentary rock on top of essentially sedimentary rock. And in between them is this unconformity, because one's Precambrian, which in the young Earth, or at least the common young Earth view, is pre-flood. Because this great unconformity marks the beginning of the flood. So anything Precambrian then would be pre-flood primarily. I mean, you can, again, debate that, but I mean, and some young Earth creationists hold different views, but many, I would say the majority of you would hold that somewhere that the flood, that Precambrian is loosely pre-flood, and after Cambrian is flood.
Yeah, you're at least giving Snelling's view for sure, right?
Yeah, Snelling's view. I mean, I think he will go a little bit into the late Precambrian, but not much. But suffice to say, in the view of many young Earth creationists, the rocks on the right are pre-flood. Okay.
This
my question is, that's pre-flood.
Yeah.
If that's pre-flood, why are we seeing sedimentary rocks before the flood? Okay. Go to the next slide. How much rock are we talking about? This gives you an idea. Yeah, from there to there.
From top here, or just like from right here?
Okay, to give you an idea, this is a view in the Sierra Ancha Mountains. I'm vertically, I'm sort of halfway up, so there is as much mountain sort of below me as above me, and all of that, or most of that, is Precambrian sedimentary rock, except for a thin layer of basalt and then a diabase intrusion. I'm actually standing on the diabase intrusion.
So this is Precambrian right here, all this?
The whole mountain, pretty much.
Wow.
The whole mountain. Okay. The whole mountain. And that's the whole thing. Mountains of evidence.
I love that. I love that title, by the way. That was absolutely brilliant, by the way.
Well, it's appropriate.
It is appropriate.
Tim McRae says that we can explain Earth's history with one major event comprising massive deposition followed by massive erosion. And anything Precambrian would basically be before this major event. And I'm seeing before my eyes a massive amount of sedimentary rock that presumably couldn't have come from the flood.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
You get the point? So let's break this mountain down. We're going to go down. We're going to kind of break it down layer by layer. So, this is one of my big observations that's early on when I started doing this work 8 years ago. I thought there is an awful lot of Precambrian rock here that would fill in that span of the great unconformity. And there's quite a bit of it that's sedimentary in origin, which, according to many flood models, shouldn't be there because this is pre-flood. So here is, well, we'll just start taking things layer by layer, the Troy quartzite. And it has 3 layers. You have a quartzite member, a Chetasky sandstone member, and an Arkose member. And so let's go to the next slide. I don't want to, there's quite a few slides, so I don't want to necessarily labor too much on it. So here is the quartzite member. You can see a nice view on the right from, or the left, sorry, of Center Mountain. And then on the right is more of a close-up view. So this is clearly sedimentary rock. I mean, it's been metamorphized to some degree, and it may not be a true quartzite, but it's sort of on the way to being a more slightly metamorphized. And there's something to notice in the sample, and I'm going to point out some things as we go. You notice how pure and white it is. It's a very white rock, maybe some darker bands in it. It's composed of almost pure quartz. Okay, very high quartz content. And this is something that we'll encounter a few times. Sedimentary rock or recycled rocks, right? You know, you have to have some existing rock to weather and erode. And there are basically two types of weathering processes. You have physical weathering and you have chemical weathering. With physical weathering, you take a big rock and you break it down into smaller rocks, but those smaller rocks chemically and compositionally are the same as big rock, they're just smaller. So you're just breaking big pieces into smaller pieces. You know, like a rock falls off, you know, so there's freezing and something chips off and everything. But there's another process, and it's chemical. And that means as things are exposed to water and the air, rocks and the minerals in those rocks undergo chemical changes. And it's pretty easy to understand why, because a lot of your igneous rocks form from magma that's in the earth. And it's in a chemical environment where you by and large don't have a lot of water and you don't have free oxygen. So all the minerals are in a state where in some sense, somewhat of an oxygen deprived kind of environment, or an oxygen limited. I wouldn't say deprived because there is still a lot of oxygen in silicate rocks, but it's an oxygen limited environment. So minerals formed with a limited amount of oxygen. Now you bring it to the surface and there's more oxygen there. So now reactions can occur that couldn't occur underground because they were oxygen limited. And that's the chemical weathering. And pretty much all of your igneous minerals will eventually react and break down at surface conditions because of the presence of oxygen and water. There's one big exception, and that is quartz. Quartz is a mineral that is found quite frequently in igneous rocks, but it also happens to be one of the few igneous minerals that is completely stable at the surface. It doesn't react with water. It doesn't react with oxygen. It's already, because it's been fully oxidized. It's one of the few minerals that's reached its full it reached its maximum oxidation state. So adding more oxygen, it's not going to drive any further chemical reactions. And so what you find is quartz eventually becomes an end product of weathering because it's the one mineral that survives.
So is that why we see a lot of quartz surface area type stuff, because it's already been oxidized, so it's not going to oxidize anymore. It's not going to be weathered anymore.
Correct.
Quartz is just about everywhere.
Yeah, and you can physically weather. You can break it down to smaller and smaller pieces, but chemically it's not changing
the actual composition of itself.
Glass. Yeah. It's like glass. I mean, why do you think they use glassware in chemistry labs, right? I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
But this takes time. This takes time. And we'll talk about this more later, but this takes time. This requires chemical reactions, not just physical. So already we see a couple things. We see a sedimentary rock that's before the flood, according to a flood model. And we're seeing those sediments being very chemically mature. You're seeing these chemical reactions being driven to completion. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. Now, Chetasky. So now this is very different. So we're seeing a very different kind of depositional environment, but this is all Yeah, still sedimentary rock. Yeah, you're intrigued by that, isn't that
I am.
fascinating?
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I love the patterns rocks form. I'm just fascinated by how the different layers get together, how the different visual things you can see to see that there's different types of things mixed in with each other and how
Oh
one's
yeah.
been laid down. I am interested in that completely. I find that to be fascinating.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, this is one of my favorite rock formations because you find these swirling patterns all over the place. But it does tell you something. Obviously, there's a mixing of two sediments there, and it's where you find evidence of soft sediment deformation. And um, the reason I mentioned that is this is something that's oftentimes invoked in uh, you know young Earth geology, where they explain things. Well, this was soft sediment deformation. That's how you can explain how some of these sedimentary rocks can kind of bend over a fold. That couldn't have happened if the rock was lithified. It had to be soft.
Yeah, they say the rocks won't bend very easily.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which is wrong for that's a whole other topic. But the easy argument against that is no way. Build a sandcastle and try and do that. Soft sediment doesn't have structural rigidity, right? And so if you move soft sediment, it's going to swirl around. Okay. So this is soft sediment. This is what happens when you have soft sediment. Things swirl around. But if everything was that way, we would see that all over the place. You see it in places, but then you go to other formations and you don't. So, but we're seeing a wide variety of the environments here. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is good. This is the Arkose member, and Arkose simply means it's a feldspar-rich rock. So unlike the quartzite, I talked about the weathering, right? Maybe just real quick here, the weathering. So the chemical weathering breaks down your igneous minerals and basically eventually reduce things to quartz. It turns out that certain minerals will weather faster. Your things like biotite and pyroxene. So some of these with the higher metallic elements weather faster. Quartz is stable. Feldspar is kind of in between. So an Arkose, think of it, it's been chemically weathered, but not to the point where the feldspars are all gone.
Is it still oxidation here? Is that oxidation? Or is that
I mean, you have
lichens or something.
Well, that's also lichens.
There's lichens here, but the color is still oxidized on over here.
Yeah, you can see the inset on the right is more the true color of the rock.
Right
the fresh surface. And look, we have ripple marks. We have ripple marks. Isn't that cool? So that shows we have evidence again of flowing water or most likely water, but it shows you have a deposition environment. Again, this is before the flood. In the conventional flood narrative, this is all before the flood. So what are all these ripple marks doing before the flood?
And they would agree. I mean, even in their view, they would have said that this is prior to the flood, correct?
Yeah, like I said, most. There are exceptions. Yeah, but the majority view would hold this to be a pre-flood rock.
Okay.
I think just about every, most young Earth geologists would admit that. And I'd say, okay, why do I have ripple marks? And remember, Clary's view, I'll go back to one major period of massive deposition and massive erosion. I'm seeing the deposition of significant quantities of sedimentary rock with really primary sedimentary features before this major event. Okay. So I'm having a hard time reconciling Clary's view of things with what I see in the field. I mean, and this is this is evidence. I mean, this is data, right? You can disagree on the interpretation, but these rocks exist.
He has to be able to explain it from his point of view, which I don't know if they've done yet.
Well, and I struggle with that. I'm just trying to take their paradigm, which, according to Clary, he says that their interpretation of the Bible matches science perfectly. It's like a perfect match. There's no discrepancies. I'm having a hard time reconciling what I'm seeing here with that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go on to the basalt layer. Okay, so now we're to an igneous layer. Okay, it's a basalt layer. There are pockets in it, you can see. So this was a subaerial kind of eruption. And again, so you have a volcanic eruption in the midst of this, but you had sedimentary rock on top, and as you'll see, we have sedimentary rock on the bottom. So whatever your narrative is, you have to be able to account for sedimentary rock above the basalt and sedimentary rock below the basalt. And the basalt is not an intrusive layer. It's definitely a it's a surface flow. Yeah.
Can I mention this real quick? Like Tim notes,
Go ahead.
I think this is pretty interesting. He notes that the ripple marks on the prior slide have spacings that you would find for normal flowing streams, which wouldn't be this turbulent type flow that one would expect from some kind of global flood, right?
Yeah, and that's a good insight, and he's the hydrologist, so
he is.
So that's something that would not have struck me. I mean, he's like, oh, cool, ripple marks. Yeah. This is neat. I wouldn't have interpreted beyond that, but yeah, for those who understand these things, it says a lot about the depositional environment. And there's a lot of knowledge here because I'm an amateur at this, but I'm having fun, and I've learned a lot. Which I think is part of science.
I thrive on that though. I think like, I do amateur stuff all the time, but I think that when an amateur does something along these lines, it shows that anybody can get into this stuff and do it. That's my whole shtick. I'm a layperson and everything. I just happen to like a lot of subjects. So I think it's even better when you go out of your area of expertise. So you're moving away from like semiconductors and material science, and you tackle something like this is great actually.
Yeah, and it shows you don't have to have a degree in something to enjoy science and to learn from the world around you.
Agreed.
Really.
This right here is the air pockets, right? That you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can see it right there. So it's subaerial. That means it was not underwater. It was not intrusive. It was flowing lava on the surface.
Cool down with these air pockets in there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's because of the depressurization. Gas that's in solution comes out of solution, but if the rock is starting to solidify, though, that gas can't escape, but it just creates voids. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about limestone now. I think, the limestone. So the Mescal limestone. So underneath the basalt, now we have limestone. So now we have a very different kind of sedimentary rock, but this is yet a sedimentary rock. And so you see on the left, sort of a nice clean picture, but on the cleanest part, just like, just a nice face, exposed face. That's interesting. Yeah, that's the stromatolite. And it's a layered structure. You can see it's like a ball or a mound, and it has all those layers. And that's formed by these colonies of microorganisms like cyanobacteria. And when they grow, they basically accumulate the calcium carbonate in their cellular structure. They die, and they just form these layered mounds that grow and grow. So this is partly
These colonies have been around for billions of years, huh? I mean, these exact same colonies that you can still see on the Stromatolites.
Yeah. I mean, they're not as common today, but you can find them today. Cyanobacteria have been around, some of the longest existing life forms on this planet have been the cyanobacteria. They've survived a lot of all the major extinction events have wiped out so many other animal species or species in general. They keep living on. They're just very simple organisms, but they've mastered photosynthesis before other plants, so they do well. But it takes time for this to grow. And this is all pre-flood, right? According to the narrative of Snelling and Clary and Baumgartner and all of this is pre-flood. And I'm finding massive amounts of limestone and these stromatolites, these colonies of microorganisms.
Gotcha.
So, okay. It's like I'm struggling more and more to fit this in the flood narrative. But it's fitting better and better into the narrative of, there was a billion years of time elapsed. This is in that time span, right? So let's. I think the next one shows the the karst. Yeah. So karst is basically, I think we're familiar with limestone. When it's at the surface, it forms caves. That's a very popular kind of feature, right? You know, Carlsbad Caverns and other caves are sort of tourist attractions because, you know, they're kind of remarkable things. One thing, and this is sort of inherent in limestone. Limestone forms in the ocean, right? It's primarily, or lakes, but it's primarily a marine type deposit. And the interesting about limestone is it is stable. It is a stable mineral at the Earth's surface in an alkali, in a high pH environment like the ocean, you know, because of the higher pH. It is not stable in a low pH environment, in an acidic environment. So it's stable in the marine environment, but it's not so stable at the surface of the Earth because you have more acidic rain, and that eventually leaches and dissolves the bedrock, and then you get sinkholes and things. And what you see here are the breccia. So basically, it's evidence that you had a sinkhole or a cave, and it started to break and fall apart, and you have those broken pieces. And then the chert, that's basically a quartz-like material that starts to fuse it back together. So it's saying a lot of things. You have a rock formation that had to have been underwater, and then at a later point in time, above the water, long enough for the acids to dissolve the limestone and form karst. So it takes time to dissolve the limestone and create sinkholes. And the limestone has to be underwater, but the sinkhole has to be above water, essentially. And just having a flood, you don't accelerate these processes. Again, you're seeing chemical processes at work that really just dumping a bunch of water on it doesn't accelerate it. And this is all in the Precambrian. Remember, this is all pre-flood, where supposedly not much was there after creation week.
So what were, okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like limestone could be formed from like diatoms and small oceanic, you know, creatures and something like that. So what would this, according to the flood narrative, what would they say was the cause of the what produced the limestone that later became higher than the whatever the water was, and became sinkholes? What actually is it comprised of?
Yeah, see, there's a lot of things in the flood model that aren't well thought out. I mean, a lot of these gaps that it's not talked about a lot. When we got on the later slide, I have a nice quote from Baumgartner I'd like to read that kind of addresses that.
Okay.
But basically, it's one of those problems that's kind of swept under the rug, to be honest.
They have a few of those that they sweep under the rug. They don't talk about certain things. It's like, don't ask those kind of questions.
You know, and Baumgartner is good in that he will occasionally mention it and not really propose a good solution, and then no one really takes it from there. And no one flags it like, well, this is a major problem with our model. We can't explain this. Like, oh, well, we haven't explained this yet. And sweep it under the rug. I never had a good experience with
Baumgartner. I reached out to him years ago, and it just, from what I remember, was not a pleasant experience.
Oh, really? How come?
Yeah, I think so. I think if I remember correctly, he's just he doesn't want everything challenged. And a few of them were like that. A few of them, you know, just didn't want anything to really, you know, be challenged. They think that anybody who wants to even talk about this stuff, if you're not a Christian, then they think for some reason you have bad faith or things of that nature, which obviously is not the case. I mean, you know as well as I do, I will allow young Earth creationists to come on and absolutely have them, you know, talk about their worldview, absolutely. But I think a lot of the PhDs that actually write for Answers in Genesis, Journal of Creation, and things of that nature, they really not there to have their views challenged. They're just there to put on information to the non-scientific young Earth creationists that they can run with and use that as a prop to say, hey, look, the Earth is young. And that's just my view on it, obviously, but I think it's actually correct. I think my view is correct on that. Yeah. From my experience.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I've not really had a lot of interaction with Baumgartner either, so I can't speak to it personally. All I really know is his writings, and he's interesting in that some of the science he does is top notch. I mean, he and you've seen this before. Many of these people are not stupid people. They are very educated. They're very talented.
Yeah, they have real PhDs. These are legit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, they're not like Dr. Kent Hovind, and I choke when I say that, who has no education hardly at all. But yeah, they are. And you know what's funny is I've actually read and looked up some of their actual thesis that they wrote for their PhDs. Like Snelling's wrote a PhD paper, you know, obviously a thesis. And I looked at it one time, you know, so it's all legit. He has a straight up legit PhD.
Yeah.
But the weird thing is though, they have to use deep time for their thesis.
Yeah. I mean, that's the world we live in.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned a point that it might be very relevant, and that is these people they're held in very high regard in the younger creationist community because they give the movement a certain sense of intellectual and scientific credibility. And many of the people who follow them don't have the kind of scientific expertise to challenge them. So they're in an environment where they're really given Humphreys is a great example of this, held in very high regard, despite all of the mistakes he makes, because there literally is no one there to challenge him.
Not from his own camp, at least.
In his own camp.
Right.
And so that's why inside the camp, they're very used to being in an environment where they're held in high regard and their things aren't questioned, which is why I think they feel somewhat threatened when someone outside the camp starts to question them, because they would have to face perhaps some real interrogation. I don't mean that in a mean way, but some real serious, hard questions to things that they can just sweep under the rug. They're not going to be able to do that with the rest of the scientific community. So I think there's this fear that if they open it up too much, they will have to address these questions that right now they don't.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah, enough on Baumgartner. Let's talk about siltstone. I think that's the next slide. So we're descending down. Remember, we're still in the Sierra Ancha Mountains. And, more ripple marks. And these are pretty large. I don't know what Tim has to say about that. The spacing there is well over a foot apart. So it's but still, you're seeing evidence of sedimentary formations. Again, before the flood. What's this doing before the flood? Because according to the paradigm given by Tim Clary, this shouldn't be here. This is before this major event of massive deposition and massive erosion. So what's all this stuff doing before that major event? And very clear ripple marks. Yeah, that's nice.
And would this be because this is more rapidly flowing water, deeper water? Because this is
I don't know.
Clearly notable.
If Tim responds on the chat, let him answer. I'm not going to speculate. It's beyond my field. But
it's definitely notable as a completely much wider space ripple mark.
Yeah. So it could be that it was a river, maybe. I don't know. Although it's symmetrical, I don't know what to say. I'm not, again, I don't want to venture beyond my area of expertise.
I'll let you know what Tim says if he's still out there.
Yeah, if he's there. Okay, so, but let's go on to the next one. This Stromatolites. Yeah, another fun thing. So again, this is evidence of sedimentary processes at work. This is really sort of another soft sedimentary kind of thing that before it totally lithifies, I don't know the whole process, and maybe Kevin could help explain it a little bit better. But it is something that happens while the sediment is lithifying, and that you have some of these things happen on the surface. But it shows a rock going through the process of lithifying and forming these structures. So again, these are sedimentary structures that point to the origin of the rock. Again, before the flood. So what are these sedimentary rocks doing before the flood? Why are they here? Go ahead, next slide. And now we go lower into the Dripping Springs quartzite. It's another Arkose layer. So again, a quartz-like sandstone with a high feldspar content. Yeah, and the ripple mark. Can you go down a little bit? Yeah, you see the angles there? Yeah, that's the cross bedding.
Right here.
Okay, that's the cross. Yeah, that's the cross bedding. Cross bedding refers to you have sort of these horizontal layers of rock, but internally those layers actually have these angled thin layers, and it's a dune-like formation. It can happen underwater, it can happen in the air, but regardless, it shows sedimentary processes at work. You know really how those things form, and there's papers where it's been studied pretty well. You have a dune, and again, you need to have some kind of fluid pushing sediment, so either water or wind flowing in a direction that pushes the sediment up, and it kind of creates this little layer, and then the next wave of sediment goes up, and they've actually photographed these things like in rivers and such, and you kind of see them grow over time. But you're seeing processes at work, or at least things that you can explain by processes, and this presumably all happened before the flood. So you can't really invoke the flood to explain it. I know. I think Tim. I don't know if he's still on, but you showed me the paper he wrote about the Coconino sandstone.
I forwarded it to you. He messaged me on Facebook. In a group that we're in. He did respond, by the way, if you want his response on the ripples.
Oh, okay. Well, let me finish this thought and then capture that. He might want to say something else. But one of the debates about the Coconino sandstone, between the young Earth and conventional geology, is whether these crossbed structures were formed in an aeolian environment by wind, or an aquatic environment or marine environment by water. And there's this debate going back and forth, because if it's aeolian, that really undermines the flood model. So people who embrace the flood model, they have a vested interest in trying to argue that the Coconino sandstone was formed by water or wind. And I would just point out here, this challenges the flood model, regardless of whether you call it wind or water, because it's before the flood, right? You can't use the flood. Yeah. So I mean, it's a different line of argument than what Tim does. But here, I don't have to argue whether it's wind or water. I just have to show it exists. Right. Say, how do you explain that? Right. Because you're saying, well, because young Earth creation will pretty much claim that any kind of cross bedding has to be water formed. It's like, fine, okay. This was not the flood. What formed this? Okay. I want to hear Tim's comment about the ripple marks.
So Tim says, need a scale on those ripples. If they are ripples, they look like they could have been in a larger river.
Okay.
And so they may not even be ripples. But again, obviously, you'd have to have some kind of scaling to measure it with. It is kind of hard to see on the image itself, even, looking at it directly here. Kevin says, Stromatolites form as the limey mud is deeply buried and compressed and slightly dissolved.
Yeah, okay. So partly dissolution. And so those things were primarily siltstone, but evidently they must have a certain amount of lime content in them to form that, which kind of makes sense, because we've been going down through this section, but we've gone from limestone to siltstone, now to sandstone. So we're definitely getting coarser in our sediments, which says something for the depositional environment. But yeah, so you have crossbeds.
Okay.
How do you explain that? And now we go the layer below that, and this is the dripping springs formation, and you see more ripple marks. More flowing walls.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then these are smaller. These are like inch scale. I'm very bad. I know some people are good about having an object that gives a sense of scale.
Like you take a picture, and I put something right here to show you the scale.
I know. Yeah. I'm bad. I'm just too much. It's the pure. The scientist in me tells me I should. The photographer in me tells me no. Because it's such a beautiful picture. I'm bringing it, and because I'm an amateur, I don't care. It's like, I'll do the size to the point.
From ridge to ridge. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's on an inch scale, whereas the ripple marks, the big ones I showed a couple slides ago, that was more like 18 inches, well over a foot between some of those. They were pretty, well, maybe a foot, but they were pretty big.
Gotcha.
I know where they are. I can always, if you want measurements, I'll, rather than As an excuse, I'm to go on the Jeep and take my meter stick and give you an exact measurement. But it just shows we're seeing an awful lot of rock here. I mean, a lot of sedimentary evidence. Let's keep going. I know we have a lot of slides. I don't want to dwell too much. Now, this is fun. I said that we see a general trend of the sediments getting coarser as we go to the bottom. This is the Scanlon conglomerate. It's the basal layer of all of these sedimentary rock in the Sierra Ancha. You can see the nice class there. Oh, much cooler. Yeah, you would call that cobble to boulder size. So some of these are several inches across. I mean, pretty big. Like hand-sized rock, baseball-sized rocks that you have here. And so I like conglomerates because I can analyze the protoliths, the rock that formed them, without having to do microscopic analysis or anything like that. It's pretty apparent. And what's interesting, you look at those clasts, it turns out this formation is resting on granite. But many of these rocks, the clasts in it, are not granite. They're actually quartz sandstone or quartzite.
So the base is granite down here, but this is going to be more of the quartz in the conglomerate?
Yeah. Which again is interesting, and the notes at the bottom. The interpretation of that is those rocks had to have been transported from some other location, to get here, because they're not found in the local bedrock. So it's not like the local bedrock was weathering to form those rounded clasts. I mean, those had to come from somewhere else. And as we get further in the presentation, we'll start seeing maybe where they came from. Sorry. But it shows that the rocks that formed these sedimentary rocks were, in fact, sedimentary rocks. So now this is another kind of dilemma for the young Earth model, because some sedimentary rock you can think of as recycled rock, right? I take a rock, I reduce it to sediment, and it solidifies, it lithifies, and you form a new rock from an old rock. It's recycling the rock material. And it's, one thing to start with an igneous rock and weather it and reduce it down to sediments and then form a sedimentary rock out of it. But we're seeing evidence here of a sedimentary rock coming from another sedimentary rock. So it's this origin question. Well, if a sedimentary rock is a recycled sedimentary rock, then it's been recycled at least twice. So that means there had to be, in the past, it implies there had to be an earlier recycling event for this to even exist.
Okay.
So that's this is starting to unfold the clues. I mean, it says even as we get down to this level, I'm seeing evidence of even earlier sedimentary processes at work. Okay, so let's go to the next one, which is, unless you have a question there.
No, Tim says, just had another thought. The big ripples could have been in shallow water, coastal environment with wave action at the surface. He says, I've seen pretty big ripples like that when he was scuba diving.
Yeah. And you could ask him, I don't know much about it, but I know one of the things they look for is the symmetry of the ripple marks, because if it's uniform flow in one direction, you tend to get asymmetry, but if it's bilateral flow, you tend to get symmetry. And that had more or less bilateral flow. So I'd be more inclined to take the second explanation because of the symmetry of the marks. But again, I'm not a
Kevin asked, was it transported by or is this transported by glaciers? Because I mean, the Young Earth Creationist model, are they saying that coarse rock was transported by the flood or something? Or I mean,
which rock?
In the prior slide.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to be honest,
the class
Young Earth Creations,
how do they get transported?
They don't talk much. They don't talk much about this area. I'm left in the dark. I mean, this is part of the problem, right? Young Earth Creationist doesn't give me the tools I need to interpret what I see.
It'd be nice to have access to them to ask these kind of questions, but like I said, a lot of them are very skittish.
Yeah. Well, they don't
Even
want
ones
to.
I get
They're
along with, they're
afraid.
very skittish. Like Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. I got a lot of respect for. I got along with that guy for like 8 years, and he will call creationists out, but he doesn't go anywhere where it's not a creationist going to be that he's talking to. And so,
Yeah.
yeah. But you know, I kind of understand why. I do from their perspective, but it would be nice just for a change to have one of the geologists from Answers in Genesis come on and talk to somebody and just have that discussion. But I'm telling you, man, I just don't see it happening in any near future. They're very skittish of this.
Yeah. You know, it's hard to get questions answered, and you know that because I've tried harder than most to try and engage in their forums, and I've learned that I worked very hard. Just the best I was able to do was get 3 letters into the Journal of Creation. And
I know that struggle.
And
I remember it well.
and you remember those letters are 1,000 words. So after 20 years, the most they allowed me was 3,000 words to explain my case on a complex
But you
subject.
found other sources to publish it, which were actually peer-reviewed, which I think is more substantive anyway. So.
Well, it is, but it's unfortunate. It's again the closed nature of their forum. Yeah. Okay.
Right,
I like this slide. I want to talk about this one. This is
Sure.
an unconformity. So you remember where we started is the East Verde River, showing the Tapete sandstone on top of granite as evidence of this great unconformity. Well, now we have the Scanlon conglomerate on top of a Precambrian granite. Same kind of situation. So it's a unconformity.
Right here?
Yeah, you see it right there. Yeah, yeah. You're learning.
It's scary because geology, and I'm going to be frank with you. Geology is my worst science. I always tell people this. Geology is my absolute worst science. I don't know why. I loved it as a kid. I had Tumblr, and I did, like making, the rock smooth and all that. So I'm interested in it. It's just not one of those things I ever really dived into. So I lack a lot of the basics on it. So I don't talk about it at all. Yeah. But I am fascinated by it. So.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, having a question to answer was a motivation. And then once I got hooked on it, I was just enjoying not just the geology, but it made me explore places I'd never been. And, I get thrilled at this, but then, walking back to the Jeep, I see a flock of wild turkeys. I'm not looking for the wild turkeys, but it's fun. It's just part of the whole wilderness experience.
I would love to be out there doing this. This would be great, man. Kidding?
Yeah. So this picture right here really breaks the flood model. It really does, in a lot of ways. So Snelling's view that this unconformity occurred when the initial phase of the flood scraped off the surface of the earth and then began to deposit, or Clary's view that there's one major event in Earth history of massive deposition followed by massive erosion. Here's a major unconformity, all in the Precambrian, all before the flood. How do you explain it? You can't use the conventional flood model to explain this because it's all before the flood. And yet I'm seeing all the things that they attribute to the flood in something that's before the flood. And you have to start thinking about it. Granite is a plutonic rock. It forms deep underground. And the chemist would probably tell you what sort of the typical depth would be. But I think it's kilometers deep underground to get the kind of mineral structure. So that granite, there had to have been enough erosion to remove all the surface layers for that granite to be exposed at the surface at the time the Scanlon conglomerate began to deposit.
So all that granite that was formed in the earth, the top layers had to have been gone for it to get exposure to it.
Yeah. So you have to. So what does this picture say? You have to have an existing landscape. You have to have an intrusion. You have to have erosion, and now you have to have deposition on top of this, all before the flood.
Well, that'd be a significant amount of deposition, wouldn't it, to get to this granite layer? That's
yeah. There's quite a bit of erosion.
Amount. Yeah.
A significant amount. But remember, in the conventional geological picture, you have 1 billion years, right?
1 billion years would do it, but
you know what I'm saying?
not a year.
Yeah, no. This is the thing, because I don't know if it's Ken Ham or somebody like that talking about the great unconformity. It's like 1.2 billion years of Earth history missing. Poof. Where'd it go? How did you know it even existed?
Well, this is why.
Well,
This is why, because you could find it in other places.
exactly. It's like when you start looking at this, you realize this fits this effortlessly fits in a picture of a long time scale. There's time for the granite to form. There's time for the erosion to expose it. There's time for the scanlon formation to be deposited. And there's time for a lot more.
And that makes
But
great
it
sense.
shows.
It makes great sense that 1 billion years would allow for all these things.
Well, and that was the whole point, right? Look for rocks. Remember that slide, look for rocks? It's like, if there really is 1 billion years of history here, I should be able to find something somewhere. If I can't find anything anywhere in this time gap, then actually I would start to question the conventional view and start thinking more carefully. Maybe the flood geologists have something. If I can't find anything. And the thing is, when I started to look for stuff, I was amazed and blown away by how much evidence I could find.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at the detail of it, you realize, oh my goodness, what does it say? I had to have a granite layer. It had to be eroded to be exposed at the surface. And then I have to have another layer deposited upon it. And this is all Precambrian. All Precambrian.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest downfall of the model is this. They're saying all this has to be Precambrian, right? So the granite had to been formed, which is going to be deep and high pressure, high temperature. It has to be weathered and eroded till it gets exposed, and then there has to be this sedimentation layer upon that, all within the period of 1 year, which they can't explain how that happens. It just did.
But yeah, that's if you use the flood to explain this. But many young Earth geologists would say this is pre-flood. So you can't.
That makes it more difficult, though, right? How is that how could it possibly be pre-flood?
Well, but based upon their interpretation of where the flood starts, this has to be pre-flood.
Yeah.
That's the whole dilemma. It's like, because this is what I realized by looking at Precambrian rock. Because at least for the young Earth geologists who say that basically that Precambrian is mostly pre-flood, and then after that is the flood strata, that they cannot use the flood to explain these things.
Yeah.
See, they're very creative about using the flood to explain all sorts of things. But at some point in time, their model, they have to pick a point in the rock strata to say, well, where did the flood start? And Andrew Snelling was standing there in Blacktail Canyon saying, I'm standing on Creation Week rock and I'm pouring into flood rock. And this unconformity is the boundary between pre-flood and post-flood. That was in the picture. And so, okay, this would fit in the pre-flood time span.
And all this is below that layer, right?
Huh?
All this is below the layer that Snelling was pointing at. I mean,
way below it.
Way below, as far as we're talking about elevation.
Way below. Remember where we started. We started at the top of Aztec Mountain, which was the Tepic Sandstone, which is where the flood started. Remember, this presentation started where the flood began. Everything after that first slide, go back to Aztec Peak, where I showed the Tepic Sandstone. That is essentially where the flood started.
I can go back real quick.
Go back.
Which one was it?
One more. One more back. Yeah.
This one?
You see, that is where the flood started, according to the picture of Snelling.
Would you remember what altitude this is at, approximately above sea level? Do you remember?
7,000 feet, I think.
7,000 feet. Okay. 7,000 feet.
Yeah. I think it's at least 6. It might be 7.
That's still up there. It's good. 7,000 feet.
It's pretty high.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's thousands of feet of these Precambrian sediments. Thousands of feet. With the picture at the end shows you how much. But this is the dilemma. So if the Tepic Sandstone at the top basically marks the beginning of the flood, because that's the layer at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that Snelling is pointing to, that flood starts here. Okay, flood starts here, Tepic Sandstone on top of Vishnu Shit. So if Tepic Sandstone is the top or the bottom or the start of the flood, then everything I'm seeing here is pre-flood.
Okay.
You can't really invoke, if you say the Tepic Sandstone basically marks the beginning of the flood, then you can't invoke the flood to explain any of this.
Right.
That's the whole point. But I mean, that's the picture, right? I mean, that's what Snelling is pointing to, and this is what they tell these tours they take down the Grand Canyon. They'll get out at Blacktail Canyon. Snelling or whoever's guiding will stand on the rock and say, "Flood started here."
I wonder what they do when they have somebody in the tour that, like you or Kevin or Tim, that knows what they're talking about. I wonder what they do when they're like, well, you know what? I'll answer your question after the tour kind of stuff. They never get to it, probably.
Well, you don't want them to push you off the boat. It's like, how good are you swimming in the Colorado River, right?
Well, you know what? Not to go too much off topic, wasn't something? I think wasn't he banned from going to the Grand Canyon for a while? Didn't they revoke his because they were taking rocks or he was doing something? Somebody was banned from the Grand Canyon, and I don't remember who it was, but they were banned for some time, or at least prohibited from doing expeditions because the permit they had was not within the parameters that they allow people to do certain things with the Grand Canyon because it's a highly regulated area.
Oh, I believe that. Yeah.
That was Snelling, but I'll have to look into that. Maybe Kevin knows. But anyways, let's go on to the Salt River Canyon here.
Okay, so we ended our trip in the Sierra Ancha, and we ended on this granite. But granite is an intrusive rock. There has to be a surrounding bedrock. So let's take a look at where that bedrock might be next. And here's the white ledges. Oh, in addition to the Jeep, I also bought a drone. You like the drone picture?
This is gorgeous. This is like 4K or something, 8K. I mean, this is like
stuff. It's incredible. Yeah. Can you go to the mountain? No, sorry, the mountain ridge. Go back to the last picture. Upper right on the horizon, the mountain ridge, higher there, right there. That's the Sierra Ancha. Those are the Sierra Ancha mountains right there. So if you remember from the map, the white ledges was sort of south and east of the Sierra Ancha. I'm looking almost due west. So that gives you a perspective there.
Yeah. Tim agrees. He thinks he said I think Snelling was taking some rocks before he asked for a permit. That was one of the reasons he finally he got initially turned down. Yeah, that's what I remember too. He was taking rocks. I think it was for dating reasons, but he wasn't allowed to do that, and so they would deny him.
Yeah, you should have a permit.
And then of course they said, well, it's because they don't want younger creationists to go to the Grand Canyon, and he tried to make it into that, which it wasn't. It was because he was removing material from the Grand Canyon, which he wasn't allowed to do.
Yeah, no, I get that. I have my own rock collection, and I don't know what all the rules are. I might get in trouble, but I try to be sensitive in that if it's a popular place like a national park, I don't touch it. If it's a place like this where it's you and the cows, and I mean,
no, it's not a national park where you can't remove certain things, but they're there in the Grand Canyon. In order to remove rocks for testing, are required to have a specific permit. Yeah.
And the difference is the Grand Canyon sees millions of visitors a year. This one,
saw you for probably.
Well, yeah. I mean, my son and I were the only people there all day. And that's the other fun. I go to these weird places that you've never heard of. I mean, you were in Arizona for a while. Did you ever hear of the White Ledges?
No.
Right.
I know Phoenix, but I am going to tell you, I'm going to look at the Santa Rosas and the some of the rocks that are around me. I'm kind of curious of what's around me. That because I'm in Indio now, so I've been there for a while.
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of curious the mountain ranges I have around me, what that would be. But I don't think that's Precambrian, but I have no idea. But,
some of the stuff is. You have to look at that. That's a whole nother discussion. Basin and range is kind of interesting in that it's either Cenozoic or it's Precambrian. There's not much in between.
Right.
Okay.
Look at this.
Yeah, some cool colors. I don't want to spend too much time. I mean, I think you're starting to see the picture, but
just
very
clear.
Just
tell me next when you want to go to the next, because.
But I mean, you can see this, and this is the thing. If this time span in question is really 1.2 billion years in duration, we should start to see sort of repeats of certain themes and processes and rocks. And we're seeing, it's like we're starting all over. Here's a beautiful example of a quartz sandstone, and you can see the layering. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you have a shale. Okay, yeah.
You have a nice shale. You can tell this is shale, yeah. This is nice shale. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then look at the colors though, the
Sorry,
green and the
yeah, this is gorgeous.
okay, the green. Oh yeah, I mean, just there's a certain aesthetic to it. It's just these were just beautiful rocks.
This is also
Yep.
rock you would find, even in Precambrian, you could still find fossils in here, would you not?
No,
No.
not Precambrian. You don't find any major fossils, right?
No, well,
Large scale.
you'd maybe some plant, maybe, would you?
No, I mean
Not all?
Kevin can get. I would defer to Kevin, but
But in the
Precambrian
Cambrian,
basically
if the
means
Cambrian
so.
shale, you would, right?
Cambrian is later, right?
Yeah, in the later shale, but when they're going out and looking for ammonites or whatever fossils, it's going to be in the Cambrian type shale.
Yeah, well, the Cambrian, Cambrian, yeah, and above, yeah,
Mhm.
and that.
But I love the strata here. That's just beautiful.
Oh yeah, yeah. And
Next.
then you go to the next one, the white ledges. Again, so you have this quartzite or this quartz sandstone, however you want to call it. But you have all the cross bedding. I mean, I've seen visually. I have thousands of pictures. I'm just picking examples here, but there's plenty of cross bedding and ripple marks and some silolites and all of that in this. Yeah. So, but the story continues. It doesn't end there. Just like with Aztec Peak, you start at the top with the layer. Well, here that's all that white ledge sandstone, and it's at the top of a mountain, and there's a lot below it. So let's keep going underneath Monumental Mountains. Beautiful view there, and there's a red quartzite, and you can see beautiful kind of ripple marks there. And on the right, the inset. Oh, go back.
Oh, sorry.
You see the cross bedding. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right here.
Yeah. You can see it's fairly thin beds, but definitely cross bedding. They're somewhat highlighted by the fact that you have alternating white and red sandstone layers there. So again, more evidence of sedimentary rock, and it just keeps going. Let's go on to the Maverick Shale. Next slide. Yeah. Beautiful shale. Okay, that's fun. Okay, the Monumental Mountains is part of a thrust belt, and so you can see the thrusting there.
Just right here, like right here.
Yeah, well, you can see. Look at the hairpin. That layer used to be horizontal, and now it's folded like a hairpin.
This right here all used to be horizontal. Here?
Well, not only used to be horizontal, I mean, it goes up and down now. So, I mean, it was bent. It was folded, which is pretty impressive. So it shows a tremendous amount of tectonic activity happening. Oh, by the way, go ahead.
I was just saying, but again, this is pre-flood, so they can't say, because a lot of younger creationists will say during the flood, the earth was rent and torn and bent, and so the rocks were put in this position, but they can't even say that because this was, according to most younger creationists, and I think probably even Snelling, this is Precambrian, this is pre-flood, so this couldn't have been something that the flood caused in their own model.
Yeah. That's the whole thing about this Precambrian study. You can't invoke the flood, at least if you believe that the flood started in the Cambrian or near the Cambrian. You can't invoke the flood.
But he pointed out in the Grand Canyon, by that layer, by that initial unconformity, that was where it started. So
I mean, if that's the model.
Yeah.
If that's the model, let's try and see. So that picture is pretty simplistic. It's like, well, I just see I see the unconformity, I can see the sedimentary rock, and I can see the metamorphic rock underneath, and there's not much feature or structure there. So, but when you start looking at the Precambrian, in particular for sedimentary rock and some of the structures and the features, it's mind-blowing.
Yep.
But it's exactly what you'd expect over the course of a billion years. I mean, it's almost like if this wasn't there, you'd begin to question the interpretation. Yeah, so this is, and now we're into another quartzite, or it's called the Dead Man quartzite. It's really more of a quartz sandstone. But again, you see some nice, well-rounded quartz class. And again, it's an example of weathering. It's a mature chemical process. So let's keep going. I know we have a lot of slides. Some of them
push through it a little bit.
Yeah, it's okay. I do want to kind of keep this under not much over 2 hours. So again, sedimentary rock has to have a bedrock. And so what do you find in that area? Well, you find a lot of, well, both rhyolite and granite, which are somewhat related magmatic formations. And this is pretty common in the area around Payson and Young, this kind of red granite. But again, this is like the you know, like the Russian doll or whatever. It's like you go to one level and you open up, well, there has to be another level here. So granite's an intrusive rock. It also has to have a bedrock. So what do you have? Well, this is on the road going north out of Young, and it's a beautiful little road cut. I mean, this is one of the things I saw on one of my first or second geology tours, and I was just blown away by everything I saw here, because the implication of what you see in this picture is huge, because you definitely see this granite cross-cutting this quartzite from the
So this is
Houdon
even deeper
formation.
bedrock.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's igneous rock intruding into basically a sedimentary rock, or a sedimentary sandstone, or a metasedimentary rock, however you want to call it. But it's definitely a rock of sedimentary origin. I mean, that's pretty much without dispute. So this granite is intruding a sedimentary rock. But again, a sedimentary rock has to have a history behind it too, because it's a recycled rock of other origin. So it says that even going this far back or down in the stratigraphic column, I'm seeing evidence of yet another round of sedimentary rock process. Remember Clary's statement, one major event of massive deposition and massive erosion, one event. How many of these events are we seeing over and over? Now you have a granite intruding a sedimentary rock.
Yep.
So let's keep going. Oh, another drone shot. So this is the Tonto Basin.
That's amazing.
This is great. Isn't that wild? I mean, some of the landforms are just absolutely incredible here. And if you look at the far horizon, you see the mountains? Yeah, right there. Those are the Mazopsal Mountains. Go a little bit. Stop right there. That's Mazopsal Peak. You just crossed it.
Right.
Yeah, high point. Yeah, that's Mazopsal Peak.
Okay.
The highest point in the Mazopsal Mountains. Again, I think close to 7,000 feet or so.
I love the elevation changes. How you can go through and see how the rock changes with accordance of elevation. Like Tonto Basin, I assume, is going to be several thousand feet lower than the peak.
Oh, absolutely. You can tell just from that picture, and the drone gives you an angle. So I mean, but that shows thousands of feet. A lot of it is sedimentary. So let's keep going. We're going down.
Oh, rhyolite.
Rhyolite, yeah. So we encounter, which is related to the granite. So quite likely, usually these things are part of volcanic centers, and you have the eruptive part, which you see at the top, but then the magma chamber underneath is usually what forms the fluton. But you can see, look at the inset, the breccia there. So that's evidence that this had to be a surface eruption, pretty much.
Yeah, because there have been creationists have said, well, during the flood there were volcanic activity and volcanic eruptions. Whether I think they're trying to include stuff like this, but that wouldn't be possible according to their own model.
No, because this is pre-flood.
Way flood,
right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This is pre-flood.
Way pre-flood. Yeah. And go to the next slide. We'll keep going here. This is really a cool picture. So this is the board cabin formation. It's underneath the Hegler rhyolite. So slightly different type of igneous rock, but again, another igneous rock. But look at the conglomerate. Go back. The conglomerate there.
Right here.
Okay, that's really cool. And so describe it. It's poorly sorted, meaning you have different size class and things like that. And it's immature. And by that, you see pretty much all of the original minerals and component rocks pretty much in the original form. And this is an example of an immature sedimentary rock. And the reason that's important is if you take basically the igneous rock on the left and kind of grind that up and glue it back together, you'll probably get something that would look pretty close to the rock on the right. Now, in other words, you can explain that kind of thing through physical processes. It doesn't take much chemical alteration. And now here's a problem with the flood model. And this, I'll read a quote from Baumgartner. This is the 2018 Conference on Creationism. And this is his paper on large tsunamis and the flood sediments. So his model basically was that an extension of catastrophic plate tectonics, which was his theory, is that the rapid subduction created huge tsunamis that covered the continent and was eroding things and creating the sediments. Now, and he said, well, there's cavitation, all these things that was, breaking down the rock very quickly to get massive amounts of sediments, because this is something the flood model has to somehow count. How do you get so much volume of sediment in so short a period of time? Well, it's through this kind of violent physical activity, the cavitation, the smashing rocks to pieces. There's a problem with that. And the problem is you can account for physical change, but you can't account for chemical change. And let me read this. This is direct from Baumgartner. I recognize that it is difficult to imagine how feldspar, even when reduced by cavitation to 0.063 millimeter particle sizes and smaller, might be transformed to clay minerals in the brief time span available during the flood. So he's acknowledging here that it's hard for him to explain chemical changes. That
because it's going to break it down to smaller pieces, but it's not going to change the underlying chemical composition of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that means when you see mature sandstones in the rock record or clays, which are shales, right, which is also a very predominant thing, which is basically the weathered product of feldspars is where you get a lot of your clays. If you see sandstone and clay, it's a sign of chemical weathering. I show this rock because this is what physical. If you have just pure physical weathering, this is what rocks look like. Mm-hmm. Which, there's in the rock record, yeah, I can understand why in certain cases maybe the physical process would dominate over chemical. But in the flood model, all the rocks should look like this, not just some of them, but all of them. Now let's go to the next slide. And so this is the Houdon formation we talked about. It's composed of mostly pure quartz. So it is, again, a chemical end product of weathering. And Baumgartner said it's hard for him to even explain clays. It's even harder for him to explain. Yeah, the quartz is even harder,
right?
Because
Exactly.
because it's your end product. So how do you get these mature quartz formations? And now we're very deep into this Precambrian study. I'm like, how many slides have we gone through? Let's keep going
right now. I think I forgot your total number. I should have looked.
But yeah. I mean,
we're getting there.
I assure you, we will get to the bottom of this pretty soon. And then interspersed between these quartzite layers, there's this siltstone, dramatic different colors and bands. But it shows, okay, so there's a lot of stuff happening here. There's changes of deposition environment. Mm-hmm. You go from a quartzite to a siltstone. Now the next picture is fun. I think this is one that Kevin liked. No, not yet. One more. But so
let me go back. I'll go back.
No, go ahead. Go back. We'll talk about
which one? This one?
No.
This one?
The flying W. Thank you. Okay, so underneath the Houdon is another igneous rock layer called the Flying W Formation, and you can see on the left there an example of the volcanic rock. It grades into the Houdon Formation. You can see the conglomerate on the right, the little insert. I'm not sure if that's the top of the Flying W or the bottom of the Udon, but there's not really a distinct boundary. It's really more of a graded composition. So again, that's an example of a poorly sorted, immature kind of rock. The matrix of it, the dark field, you can imagine it really looks like it came from the Flying W. It was pulverized. But you see the larger class that obviously had a different origin. They're more quartz-like. And so, again, there had to be a history behind this. There had to be a history behind those quartz layers. So let's go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry. 10 points out real quick. He says, Sonic says there would have been a tremendous upheaval at the start of the flood, which I've heard before. He says no discussion of the frictional heat release that would be involved. We've talked about that before many times, the heat problem. The multiple types of heat problems. The heat problem with the flood, the heat problem with the reactivity. We've actually, I've had Dr. Loechelt and Dr. Hinkie both come on and talk about a lot of that prior. He also says, this is interesting. Tim says, Baumgartner's cavitation erosion equation was massively problematic. It's rigged to erode hundreds of feet of sea bottom a day when water flowing over Niagara Falls at the same speed does far less, which is interesting because the water going over Niagara Falls obviously going to have cavitation air, the gases coming out of solution. You're going to have a massive amount of erosion because of that, but nowhere near what you would get, what he would have to have to basically erode hundreds of feet of sea bottom a day. So the numbers just don't work for their figures there. But,
no. There's a lot of things.
Others. I won't get into the past, but you've literally shown that their formulas they use are not just problematic. I would say they're outright wrong. They're just modeling wrong.
Yeah, and Baumgartner it's fascinating because he will model some parts of the problem with this tremendous rigor and then throw in these totally bizarre assumptions. So not to get too far off topic, but the other things I noticed about his tsunami model, number one, he had an arbitrary forcing condition to create the tsunamis that I think is unrealistic. And then he noticed this, because I do a lot of modeling, so I understand when you have numerical instability and things like that. He mentioned he had a problem with numerical instability, and he solved that problem by imposing basically a damping factor, which represented that basically once the sediment got to a certain height, it would limit out and not get any thicker. And you see, I think this is very artificial because sometimes when you see numerical instability, it's not just a mathematical artifact. It's showing that the physical problem you're modeling is unstable. And I think what's happening in his model, he had this high turbulent flow, and you're not going to get these nice, smooth, flat layers of turbulent flow. And what probably happened was that the grid size he picked had sort of like a filtering effect where at a certain length scale, you wouldn't see let's say if the turbulence was at a smaller scale than its grid, it wouldn't impact the solution. And then as the simulation grew in time, you would have more, how should I say, the turbulence, once the turbulence gets on the scale of your grid, then it would start impacting the results. And so he had to suppress that.
So it's kind of like a fudge factor, maybe, because some of them.
There's a lot of fudge factors.
Some model they want laminar flow. It's like pick a lane.
Yeah, and then you see, I think if you didn't throw that in, what you would find is that the turbulent flow would not create the strata of nice, flat, uniform layers. That you would have a very rough, irregular landform with highs and lows, because that's the nature of it. Because there would be this feedback. Because once you start, what happens when you have floods and things? Once you have a little divot and water flows there, it will tend to gouge out faster and then leave material to the side. So you don't smooth things out with turbulent flow. You will actually gouge things deeper. The great example of that is where I grew up in the state of Washington. Go to the Grand Coulees, the Missoula flood, and just look what it did to the Columbia Plateau. Okay, that's what fast-flowing water does. It took a flat basalt plateau and gouged it out, because that's what turbulent flow does.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't create these nice uniform strata.
Very rough gouging rather than smooth strata layers.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So shales. Again, Baumgartner says he can't explain the presence of clays, which is what these rocks are composed of. On top of that, as Kevin pointed out, when you start seeing slates, now it's showing some sign of some metamorphic activity. Some heating has to occur.
Mm-hmm.
So
and
again,
the flood's not going to create that metamorphic activity. Let's be clear here. I don't think they've even suggested the flood, although they said there's great heat there is going to be heat for the flood if it did happen, but do they really think that the flood is able to produce the temperatures and pressures needed to produce?
I don't know, but the thing is, then why aren't the other layers affected as well?
Right, it was very selective in the layers that it somehow affected. Right.
Whereas this is pretty. You can say, well, maybe all this happened long before, let's say, the other layers were deposited, which in a billion-year time span is very probable that you can have deposition, you can have folding and metamorphism, erosion, and then again deposition. But that requires more than one episode of deposition and erosion, which according to Dr. Clary, is not possible. There's only one. There's only one event. Right. If you allow for multiple events of deposition, metamorphism, erosion, and follow deposition, you can explain a lot of this very
that's
easily.
Basically what deep time would be, though, right?
Well, that's the whole point, right?
Right.
Now you're saying that what their model struggles to explain is just the obvious product of a deep time model. That's
Correct.
exactly what you'd expect. It's like, if you didn't see this, you'd question the time scale. But the fact, all this evidence is here. It's exactly
mountains of evidence.
The type of mountains of evidence. So talking about tectonic activity, look at this tectonic activity. This is pretty impressive. The folding of these quartz, or these, pretty much quartzite layers, or quartz sandstones, or meta quartz sandstones, however you want to call it, something in that range. But the Houdon, that's Mount Houdon there, actually, right there. It's an anticline. It's pretty much folded like a horseshoe. It's a cool mountain. I've only been at a distance. One day I want to actually walk up among those rocks.
This looks like it's actually transversal. I mean, you can actually climb up here, right? I mean,
well, that's my dream. One day I want to where your mouse is. I want to be standing and take a picture. Okay?
I would have done that in my 20s. I would have been right with you. I used to love going up these types of little foothills and mountains, and I love the view and the this being out there in the outdoors. But I was in better shape.
Oh, yeah. Well, I need to get better shape too. But this is motivating.
You got a Jeep though, so
I have a Jeep. Yeah, but I can't drive up there, but it gets me close, right?
Yeah, there's no trails up here or anything, obviously.
No, but I go off trail sometimes, which is kind of fun. But that's an adventure in itself. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. This is fun. And again, at the bottom here we find another conglomerate, and just the diversity of class. So you can see that looks like a little piece of jasper, and I didn't have a close up to really identify that, but you can tell just from the color variation, a pretty diverse group of source rock to form that. So again, there's a history behind this rock. It's a recycled rock. There had to be something before it.
Yeah, this is all recycled for these clasts, right? It's just the class.
Yeah. So and then this is near the bottom. So this unconformity again. So we meet it again. We talked about the Scanlon unconformity before. So essentially, it's kind of the same unconformity, except that underneath you don't have granite, nice igneous rock. You have pretty much all of these alder formation, alder group sedimentary rock. Some of them are igneous, but most of them are sedimentary. And so now you have you have an unconformity between sedimentary rock and sedimentary rock, and the sedimentary rock underneath it had to be deposited, tilted, and eroded before this happens, right? So again, Dr. Clary says one major event of massive deposition, massive erosion, and I'm seeing an episode of erosion, metamorphism, deposition, metamorphism, erosion. No, sorry. One more time. I'll do it. All right. Deposition, metamorphism, tilting, which might have been along with the metamorphism, and erosion before you start another period of deposition.
It's almost like they need like multiple floods to explain some of the stuff.
Yeah. That's the whole point.
Which wouldn't do it, but at least help them a little bit. It wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and that's the whole point, right? I mean, this idea, this one size fits all of we can explain all of the geologic evidence with one big event is not there. I'm seeing multiple events, which in the conventional geological picture is very, very reasonable. Yep. That you had multiple tectonic events. And look, this is gorgeous. I love this one.
This is gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
I like this one, too.
Oh, yeah. So remember when we looked at the Scanlon conglomerate in the Sierra Ancha, I posed the question that it's interesting that the clast did not look like the surrounding bedrock, and they must have been transferred from somewhere else. Well, this is north of that area. And now we see something different. If you look on the left there, the three big clasts, that one right there, that's very similar to what you find, the rocks you find in the Misatsa Mountains. Okay, go to the next one. That's very similar to the Hegler rhyolite, or, there's other rhyolites there, but I mean, it's similar to that. And that looks a lot like the Gudok Formation. So here you do see evidence of the clast coming from the surrounding bedrock, which says that this landscape provided much of the clast for the Scanlon conglomerate, not only here but further south, where you see it in the Sierra Ancha. It probably was transported from the source region. But I like the insert on the right because that's not a surface rock. That's deeply embedded in the conglomerate.
So this is actually part of the bedrock. This is not just a surface rock.
Oh, yeah, that's solid. You couldn't pry it out with your hands unless you tried really hard with a tool or something.
These are all surface rocks up here. Obviously.
No, that's all. This is all solid rock. That's all solid. Yes.
Really?
The cementing is incredibly strong.
Wow.
It's incredibly strong. It looks like they would just pop right out.
Yeah, it does. Looks like they're top rock, sort
of. But I can test you, that those aren't loose rocks. I mean, it's a very solidly cemented formation. But that's a conglomerate in a conglomerate. So you have to think about the history behind it.
So is this from a totally different source? Maybe is this conglomerate? Is this conglomerate from a totally different source from the surrounding conglomerates?
Yes, it has to be.
Yeah.
Basically, because it's like, sedimentary rock is recycled, and inside of it is a rock that was recycled. So you have.
Yeah, this in itself seems like just to make the whole flood model just. I don't even. And again, this is Precambrian, so it's pre-flood to them.
Yeah,
I would like to see how they explain it, because I have no idea how they even explain this.
No, I mean, there are so many of these paradoxes you find at all different length scales. Mountains and ripple marks and class like this. So there's a whole lot of things that are hard to explain. Mm-hmm. I know it's getting late. Let's try and wrap this.
Do you know how many what your total was as far as how many slides there was?
I don't know. There's probably about 8 left.
Okay, we'll push through.
Yeah.
Gorgeous too.
Okay.
Was this on a drone?
Yeah, this is another drone shot. Yeah, you can see I like my drone. So one of the things, we were in the Tano, the tributaries of the Tano Basin. There were a number of geologists that investigated that region. They never truly found the bedrock, because sedimentary rock has to rest on something else. You can't just have sedimentary rock on nothing. Ultimately, you have to come to some kind of igneous or metamorphic bedrock. Otherwise, you need a platform. And the interesting is, the researchers in the Tano Basin, Upper Tano Basin, could not find the bedrock. I mean, the stream cut wasn't deep enough. You really have to go all the way to Tana Creek itself. And we're looking for what's called juvenile crust, and that is crust that you can explain, that can exist without any prior crust before it. A good example is like your basalts on the ocean floor, that come from mid-oceanic ridges. You have mantle-derived magmas. It's crust that you can form directly from magma, and it doesn't require any kind of prior crust. So we're looking for that, and we have to go all the way down, next slide, to Tonneau Creek. So we're kind of getting to the bottom. Mm-hmm. So remember, you're asking about elevations. This is probably under 2,000 feet at this point.
Getting much lower to sea level.
Actually, it might be close to 2,000 feet because Phoenix is already, 1,200 something. But you're probably at the 2,000 foot level. So 5,000 feet below the high points we've talked about. Go to the next slide. So here we have basalt. And this is not the type of basalt you would see at the surface. Sorry, this is the type of basalt you'd see at the bottom of the ocean. And the little inset there you see, that's a sheeted dike complex. Do you see how things are kind of angled diagonally? Go back to the insert. Yeah, do you see the diagonal kind of layers? Yeah,
here?
Yeah. But follow that. Go. You see whether there's sheets of them, just kind of stacked to the side. You see, go more to your upper right. Yeah, do you see? Follow that plane.
Here?
Follow the plane that you had. Yeah, do you see? But you can draw a whole bunch of those lines if you look. You can draw.
Here?
Yeah, that's another one right there.
Here?
All right. Yeah, absolutely. You start seeing all these planes. Okay, that's the sheeted dike. And it's very typical of sea floor spreading. So this is
getting closer to the actual seabed.
Absolutely.
Or this was seabed.
That it was seabed. It's called an ophiolite, which means a portion of oceanic crust that is now on continental crust.
Gotcha.
In fact, one of only 3 Precambrian ophiolites in the world, I believe. Only one of 3.
Gotcha.
Where you have Precambrian oceanic crust that now is on the continent and accessible on the continent. You don't have to go underwater to find it. Oceanic crust doesn't last a long time because of plate tectonics. Most of your ocean basins disappear after. I mean, the crust, the ocean may persist, but the rocks, usually the plates, will disappear after 100 million years or so.
Okay.
So it's hard to find oceanic crust. And yeah, now we're going back to where we started. So kind of bringing things to close. But remember the very first slide, the East Verity River, the Tapete sandstone on top of granite. Mm-hmm. Well, this granite now is intruding this oceanic basalt, this crust.
This is literally where you have the granite and the base basalt rock from the bedrock from the oceanic floor. This is where they're going to be intruding on each other.
Yeah.
As they say, rock bottom.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're rock bottom, right? So this is the end, pretty much. But there's a little postscript and a couple more slides that are just blow my mind. So we've kind of come to the end. We found oceanic crust. So I mean, we're really at rock bottom. But if you go back to Tonneau Creek, you see something very, very fascinating because you see this basalt, this oceanic magma intruding granite. And we had a discussion with Kevin and some interesting things came out of that. But number one is if you have this oceanic magma or this mountain-derived magma intruding granite, it suggests that there was pre-existing crust. I mean, you're seeing this oceanic crust, which was juvenile, but somehow there were these fragments of pre-existing crust that were there. And the other thing Kevin pointed out that when magma crystallizes, if it's deep underground, you will have a plutonic rock. You'll have clear evidence of crystal growth. If it's near the surface, it'll be more. You have smaller crystals and things like that. So the basalt here basically lacks any crystalline structure. It's aphanitic. It has no crystals. The granite, on the other hand, is very clearly a crystalline.
And this is very clearly the intrusion from the basalt, from the volcanic activity going.
Absolutely.
Intrusion of the granite, not the other way around. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I have plenty of pictures. I mean, the cross-cutting relationship. I mean, you can see in the insert the granite more close up, and the basalt is almost like that little tar It looks like tar. Yeah, right there. That's actually a very thin fissure or crack in the granite, and the basalt just kind of wiggled itself. It's a low
That's so
viscosity
cool.
magma.
Because this actually literally
Yeah.
was volcanic magma basically one time, right? That kind
Yeah, and it just kind of inserted in there.
Nice.
But the point is that the granite must have been deeper underground when it formed, but at the time it was intruded, it must have been closer to the surface.
Gotcha.
So what you're seeing here is a fragment of pre-existing crust that must have existed before the ocean floor that we just talked about, and not only was it pre-existing crust, but it must have had enough time to again have the granite for there to be erosion
literally
above
continental
the granite.
crust, right? Literally continental crust.
Yeah, well, continental type crust. It could have been like an ocean island arc. I think a lot of geologists think that it was like a series of islands. So think more like I don't know if Hawaii's a good example, but some of your island chains, huh?
Like an archipelago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the modern islands well
Kevin
enough.
says ocean water on. He says yes, ocean water on continental crust.
Yeah, but so here implicitly there is a large amount of erosion to expose the granite before the intrusion.
Yeah.
And go to the next slide, because the next slide is one of my favorites. This just blows my mind, because we just argued there had to be a lot of sediment. There had to be a lot of erosion exposed to granite. Well, where'd that granite go? Or where'd the sediments go? And near Gisela, there's a geological formation called a pendant. And think of it like an island of rocks surrounded by magma that's just been cooled. And literally it's like that. I mean, you can walk these things and you can map out, just sort of walk around them like a small island, and you can see the boundary, because all the surrounding rock is this gabbro, very distinctive oceanic crust type igneous rock, and then it surrounds this tiny little island of sedimentary rock. And I believe, and there's good reason to believe that like we said in the last picture, the granite, there had to be a tremendous amount of erosion to bring that granite close to the surface at the time of the intrusion. There's good evidence that those sediments might have gone here, some of them. And because it's a very volcanic rich kind of sediment, it's rather immature, meaning there wasn't a whole lot of time for chemical weathering, but you do see they're beautiful cross bedding. I mean, it's just fascinating. These are not big formations, but the detail that's preserved. And my favorite is that main picture on the left, ripple marks. This is probably from a rock that likely dates 1.75 billion years old.
Wow.
And I'm seeing practically pristine ripple marks.
Preserved very well.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, somewhat ironic. I was on the field, and actually I was hiking with a friend. He's more the age of my oldest son than my age. We were hiking, and he happens to be a dear Christian friend, very strong, young earth creationist. But I don't bring the subject up because I don't want the controversy. But we had done our hike, and we just wanted to do some sightseeing, just some wandering around before sunset. He's very much into outdoor stuff, so I love talking to him. And he was just walking around, and I was showing him this spot, and he was standing on this flat rock, kind of like a teeter-totter and everything. And I go, Kyle, get off that rock. That's a very interesting rock. I want to look at it. He was just kind of standing on it like a teeter-totter, and I go, that's an incredible rock. I'm going to keep it. That's a keeper in my collection. But it shows, if all of the geological associations correct, it's a 1.75 billion year old rock that predates the oceanic crust that was in the area, and there are practically pristinely preserved ripple marks in it.
Nice.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom that, but it's like, how do you explain this in a flood model? It just it blows my mind in any kind of model. But
he doesn't explain it to you, right? I mean, he just, or he has something
What's
ad hoc.
that?
Well, your friend, when you do talk.
We never even talked about it. Like I said, I avoid the subject
Gotcha.
because it's a friendship. You know, it's like
No, I
I don't
understand,
want.
of course.
You know, it's like
But I
it's
think if
not.
you guys are out there together looking at the same evidence, you know, at least the conversation would just kind of come up a little bit. But
No, it didn't. You know, it doesn't matter.
okay.
Yeah, we have a couple slides left. I want to. We've gone over 2 hours here, so I just want to. You know, that's. I know I've just kind of overwhelmed you with information, but these stratigraphic diagrams are helpful to just kind of put everything together. Can you start at the top of that one? Yeah, just start. Yeah. Okay, we go through it. Troy quartzite, we talked about. Basalt, we talked about that. Paleokarst, we talked about that. Mescal limestone, we talked about that. Dripping springs, upper and lower, we talked about. Pioneer shale. If you look at the little drawing there, they show the scanlon there, the little circles. So, and that was about like just the first third of our presentation. I don't have a diagram here for the white ledges, but let's go now to the panel on the left.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I didn't mean to
go
do
back.
I know.
Upper left, yeah. So this is Mesothel mounds. Yeah, go over the words. Okay, Mesothel quartzite, we covered that. The Maverick Shale, we covered that. Deadman Formation, we covered that. We didn't talk about Oxbow, but we did talk about Hagler rhyolite. Go down. Go down again. We didn't talk about the winter cap, but we did talk about board cabin. So a lot of volcanic type layers there. We talked about the Houdon. We talked about the Flying W. We talked about the bread pan. And then we didn't even talk about this East Verde Formation, partly because I've not been able to do enough field work there to really have enough samples to put together a good story. But that's a whole, we skipped that. If you look at the thickness scale, that's 2 kilometers of rock that we just kind of skipped.
This is still a billion and a half worth of formations.
Yeah, all of these are Precambrian.
Yeah,
all of these are Precambrian. Okay, every single one of them. You know, all of this is pre-flood, according to the flood model of Snelling and Clary and all of that. And you see at the bottom there, bottom left, the Payson ophiolite. Like I said, ophiolite is simply an oceanic crust that is now on the continent. And oceanic crust doesn't last long in the ocean because of subduction. So actually, these are some of the best ways we have of studying the oceanic crust. And then if you go towards the bottom, you see the pendants there and the granodiorite, 1.75 billion years.
Were they argued that this is basically created in situ? Like God just created it?
Let's go then. Well, let's keep going because I think the last slide talks about that. So because we have only 2 slides left. So let's finish this and then we can talk at the last slide.
Yep.
So, okay. So, I mean, we had a hypothesis, right? Look for rocks. Okay. What was the study successful? Did we find rocks?
Found rocks. Found lots of rocks.
We found rocks.
Different kinds of rocks.
Lots of rocks.
Yeah, lots of rocks.
Okay. So, and what were the hypotheses? One was, well, if mainstream science is right, we should find abundant rocks of all sorts and types, but without fossils. But aside from that, we should find, we'll find sedimentary rocks and igneous rocks. We'll see all the kinds of processes we've seen later. You know, there's no reason to believe why the stuff that happened Cambrian on, many of those things would have happened Precambrian. Young Earth, well, what was the Young Earth model? Well, Clary stated it very succinctly, right? One major event, massive erosion or massive deposition followed by massive erosion. Okay, so prior to that event, that major event, there shouldn't be much deposition and there shouldn't be much erosion, right?
But
the model is one major event, massive deposition and massive erosion. Prior to that event, we should not find much deposition and much erosion. We've documented 20 unique rock formations, at least. But, you know, I counted. And that's not including the intrusive ones. These are just the ones that are, what we call the stratified ones. So either lava flows or sedimentary rock. 20 unique rock formations, and some of them with very distinct sedimentary features in a period that was before this major event of massive deposition and massive erosion. How do you explain all of that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the last slide because this is our discussion slide.
I'm sorry. Let me go back. What's that?
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, we've. Okay.
I'll go. I'll get it.
That's okay.
I'll go all the way.
Yeah, you just have to slow down.
Yeah, I know. I have to
But I'll just start talking while you get there. So we know young Earth creationists will not abandon their flood model or their views. I mean, it's like that is so deeply embedded in their worldview. It's not negotiable. And that's the thing. It's not something that evidence even plays a role. But I would say that the flood model, especially what was presented by Snelling and by Clary and by Baumgartner, I call it mountains of evidence from the Precambrian. I mean, literally mountains. I mean, you have to explain the whole Methophil mountain range and the Sierra Ancha and the White Ledges. And these things really don't fit the model. So let's consider some possibilities. So possibility one is maybe all of this rock really was just made on creation day 3. So to claim that, I mean, you have one day, and Snelling says that God did his work during the daytime and not the nighttime, so that means it's 12 hours, and there's other stuff, there's plants and stuff that has to happen on day 3, so you're restricted hours. So really, you're essentially saying these things are just created in situ instantaneously. All the sedimentary features, all of everything that we'd attribute to folding and tectonics and ripple marks and flowing streams and everything never even existed. It's just God created the structure in situ as is. I mean, that's one possibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of goes back to that notion of, well, God created the rocks with fossils already in them,
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's a very ad hoc explanation.
Yeah, I mean, but you're kind of left with that. I mean, if you claim that these really are creation day 3 rocks, and that's one position Snelling could take. I say it's creation day 3. This is creation day 3.
Mm-hmm.
If it's creation day 3, then these things had to be just created in situ, and stuff that looked like it was created from flowing and running water or so. The water was never there. Nothing really happened. It really was just rocks. I don't know how it just got poof or whatever, but it was there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That has its problem. So let's take option number 2. And this goes along the lines of some alternate flood models. Michael Ord, I think, is one of the best advocates. He takes a different approach as well. It's kind of a solution to the problem, to phrase it in Clary's term. Well, one major event with massive deposition followed by massive erosion. If we find sedimentary rocks in the Precambrian, then the flood must have happened earlier, sort of, in the time scale. And he puts the flood deep into the Precambrian. And I mean, that has a whole bunch of problems, but one big problem, well, the motivation, let's put it this way, the motivation for that is that's how he can say, well, the flood did it. Because he basically says, if it's sedimentary rock, it's probably the flood. No matter where you find it, no matter how you find it, it must be the flood.
Yeah, Tim says Ord is the one that does. Is the only one he knows that does that. But again, Tim says Ord is the only flood geologist that endorses number 2.
That really puts it there.
But where are the wouldn't they have fossils in it? Wouldn't we expect to have fossils?
Yeah. See. So okay.
This is
a
pretty big problem.
Yeah. Let's take Ord's. Let's take the evidence that we've seen and try to explain it in terms of Ord's model. So the flood comes, and now we're depositing like the Breadpan Formation, the Houdon Formation. Now we have these volcanic eruptions. Now all of these, now you have a major tectonic event, and all these rocks get tilted. Now we have to have erosion. Now we have to deposit the methophils. Now we have to erode them. Now we have to deposit the scanlon and all of these other layers up to the Mescal limestone, up to the Troy Formation. Oh, and by the way, now we're going to start to deposit fossils. Like, how could there be anything living left at that point?
Hydrological sorting, I think, is one of the rescue devices they have for that, which makes no sense.
How do you? But yeah, I mean, you can only sort so much.
Yeah.
But how? Okay, you're now. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that the flood did all the things that are attributed in the Phanerozoic. Now you're tripling the amount of stuff it has to do, and all the while not killing without killing anything.
Yeah, and still not explaining. I mean, it's really not that much of a
No.
rescue device. It's more of a
No.
rescue device that we're just going to throw this out here. A lot of creationists are not going to really have the expertise, and I think for some of the stuff, no offense to any of my guests who I think are absolute geniuses, I don't think you need an expertise to even see the problems here. You just don't.
No, it's
They're very
pretty
late
obvious.
problems here. It's just there's some major issues here.
Yeah, and that's why I tried to keep this very simplistic. I mean, there's no equations. It's very different than my last talk, right? No equations, no simulations, no math.
So smart, it's ridiculous.
No dating methods, no numbers. Just a lot of pictures. But
yes, pictures are good. Pictures are good.
It tells a lot. And then the last one, well, maybe it happened between creation and flood, but yeah, and that's sort of a quiescent period. That's supposed to be even more quiet than the world today because we're still really.
But that'd be 4,000 years to produce all that Precambrian sediment.
So
that makes no sense
and Steve Austin has a model that kind of is a combination of all three. I mean, you can mix and match these, to say, well, some of it was creation day 3, some of it was flood, some of it was antediluvial, but still. How do you really fit all of this evidence in the flood model?
Right.
And I'm at a loss, and I don't want to be too critical of flood geologists, but I say, hey, number one, your model doesn't fit the data. Contrary to what Dr. Clary says, it's not this beautiful, perfect fit between our model and the data. This is the data I see. It doesn't fit your model. You don't give me any tools to explain it. I've not found any good resources.
So what's your final analysis?
The old Earth is the best explanation. And it's like you don't even have to try to explain this with old Earth. This is exactly what you would expect in a billion years. This is exactly the kind of thing you expect in a billion-year time frame. You'll see multiple tectonic events. You've gone through, one major supercontinent and breaking up. You have multiple volcanic eruptions, followed by periods where there's a lot of eruption, and then another round of deposition. Sedimentary basins form, and they close up, and there's uplift. And, anyway, it's exactly what you would expect.
And it's funny you mentioned that, and I'm going to end the presentation here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I can stop sharing here. And let me do.
Are we done, or are we still on there?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, we're definitely on there. I just took off the presentation. I was going to show the other stuff, but yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I did a presentation on something that you're familiar with as well, the radiometric halos, which Gentry's work. So I did a 2-hour presentation on that, and I showed some of the rescuing devices, some of the things that he was making, I think, gross mistakes on. But Gentry actually did. He came out and basically said, look, it's God did it in situ. He's taking his claim out of the scientific arena because Gentry made some massive blunders. But I think we're seeing something very similar here with flood geology and Austin, is that they have to have these post hoc or ad hoc explanations, none of which are going to come remotely close to explaining anything. So if you had to just say, what was the best explanation, I can't see how a rational person cannot say it's an old Earth. It's not an old Earth. The only explanation is the old Earth because everything else just doesn't work. But they have to, for some reason, put that old Earth view ahead of anything else. It doesn't matter what it is. That's why I think that their religion is young Earth. Their religion is not, and I don't mean to be flippant, but their religion is not Christianity. Their religion is young Earth creationism, because they have to put that young Earth creation first and foremost above anything else. And that's why I think that young Earth creationism is more of a religion to them than Christianity itself. And that's my own personal view. You don't obviously have to decide with that.
No. I have major theological issues with young Earth creationism. In a lot of ways, I don't. There are very many things in it that are not what I call Christianity. So I think that's more or less what you're saying.
Yes.
There's a lot of things that really don't fit Christianity on many levels, even like with Humphrey's moral and ethical level, things that he has said and done that I think are unethical and unchristian and actually sinful, and things that, if you believe in a Christian worldview, you'll have to stand before God and judgment on that. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I know you're not a Christian, but I think, if the Bible is right and is true, I believe a lot of them are in some very deep trouble when they stand before God in
It
judgment.
would seem to
I mean,
follow, and that's why I have a lot
and
of
that's
respect for
that's
certain
my
Christians.
conclusion. It's a sober thought. So
Dr. Seigart. I mean, I have a lot of respect for him. His
yeah,
field is biology. I did a show a year with Dr. Fuzrana, who's obviously very Christian because he works
yeah,
with Reasons to
yeah.
Believe, an organization you're well familiar with. Dr. Hugh Ross, I have a lot of respect for. I disagree with him on a lot of
Oh
stuff,
yeah,
but I respect them as Christians
yeah,
because they don't put this weird scientific nonsense of young Earth creationism ahead of their actual Christianity, and I have to respect that.
yeah,
I really do.
yeah,
And so a person could be
yeah.
an atheist,
I know you
agnostic,
do it.
Christian, and I think as long as they look at the science and objectively look at it, then I have respect for them because they're looking at something
Yeah,
that is objective. And like
yeah,
you said, what do we expect to find? Which hypothesis explains it better? You're not going around
mhm,
saying my explanation is God. My explanation for these
yeah,
rocks is God. No, you're saying
yeah,
here's the explanation for why would we find these type of Precambrian sedimentary rocks? Why would we find these intrusions? Why do we find these granite layers? Oh, because the Earth's been around for billions of years. And then using
yeah,
that, we can explain it through natural
yeah,
processes. I
yeah,
have the utmost respect for that, man. I really do.
yeah. Well, that comes across, and that's why this is. I find this as a nice forum because you do take, in a sense, a stand of neutrality. You're not hostile to Christianity, although
Not at
you're
all.
critical of things, and that's fine. That's fine. What was I going to say? The other thing is a lot of the younger creationist arguments are data star.
They are.
You go back to the picture at the beginning. Okay, this tour, this Grand Canyon tour, rafting trip, which they do frequently, and they take a group and say, "Hey, look at this unconformity. How do you explain this? This doesn't, what makes you think that there's billions of years between these rock layers? Um, there's a better explanation. It's the flood. The flood scraped away the landscape of creation day 3 and then began to deposit this massive layer of sedimentary rock. And if all you had was that picture, it's not a it is a fairly compelling
Yeah. I'm showing it to the
story,
outside
right?
again. You're not seeing it, but I am showing it to the outside of exactly what you're
Yeah,
talking about. And yeah,
yeah,
it would be compelling. But again, I think that Snelling and the rest of them have to keep the believers believing because
yeah,
they're. And I know this from personal experience, and I know you do too. Not to get into some of the things we've had discussions with, but we've been at this a very, very long time. You guys were on like years and years,
yeah,
been around on my program, so but I think that people like Snelling, I think deep down they probably don't believe as much as they want people to believe. I think that they can't reconcile young Earth creationism with their actual understanding of the topic, and I think that cognitive dissonance. I don't know why they do it. I don't, but I think they would have to have cognitive dissonance. And I don't think that Snelling is one of the true blue believers as you would find like Humphreys. I think Humphreys is an absolute true blue young Earth creationist believer. I'm not convinced about Snelling. That's my
okay.
personal opinion.
And it's hard to say. Again, that's getting into
Right. It's a theological thing, and
psycho.
I'm not a psychic.
Yeah,
But it's just when I see certain PhDs in the young Earth creationist movement, it's just hard for me to really believe that they believe the young Earth creationist narrative. Some of them, not
yeah,
all of them. I don't. Like I said, I absolutely
yeah,
think that some of them do. Like Humphreys does. I think that Sarfati does.
yeah,
But some of the other ones, maybe not so much. But
yeah. But I think the thing that I notice is, like with that Grand Canyon tour, if that's the only evidence that someone is presented with, it's very easy to convince them
yeah. But like
that
Kevin points out, because I've read
true.
these, Kevin's exactly right. I've looked into these. Snelling actually has articles on billions of year old uranium deposits in Australia.
Yeah,
His actually thesis was on
yeah,
that very thing in Australia. I don't remember the name of the paper, but
yeah,
I downloaded it. But yeah, so I mean, it's hard to reconcile
yeah,
when you have, especially geology, right? Geology is one of those
yeah,
subjects where it has to have deep time to get your PhD because it's all deep time. None of his young creationist
yeah,
model would ever worked in anything that he ever studied to get his advanced degrees.
And that's the argument they'd use, like, hey, we had to play the game to get our degree. You know, we had to play along. We had to play by your rules. I mean, we didn't believe it, but you know, you're not going to give me the degree if I don't say the right word.
I think that's nonsense, right? I mean, I don't know if it was Baumgartner, but there was
it could be, but honestly, you know, I don't worry about them too much. It's in a sense the innocent people who are more like my friendship group and things like that, who will see the thing from Snelling, and if that's the only thing they see, you know, it's very easy to be persuaded. And my goal with a talk like this is for them, for the people who embrace young Earth creations because they don't know any better.
Right.
They just say, hey,
I can't
look at the evidence here, and maybe reconsider. Maybe just
some of them do. I have had, you know, I've changed the mind. Like I did a debate with Wayne Fillmore. It was on macroevolution, and he changed his mind on that. He left young Earth creationism. He became a science teacher. Yeah. So people will change their mind. Tim says he's seen Snelling speak several times, and he sometimes sounds like he doesn't really believe what he's saying. And there's another young Earth creationist. I can't remember his name off the bat, but he has a actual degree in nuclear engineering. But he wrote his paper on like rubidium, strontium decay. And things that require billions of years worth of radiological decay. There's no way of getting around that. That's one of the problems the rate study has with the heat problem. But that's what he wrote his paper on, and it fully acknowledging that these times require billions of years. So I don't know why they forsake it for the young Earth creationist narrative, because somebody like yourself, who is a Christian, you don't have to subscribe to young Earth creations to be a Christian. So I don't know why that means so much to them. I've never had one explain to me other than, oh, well, I'm just a Bible literalist. Well, okay, that's fine, but that doesn't explain to me why you have to be such a Bible literalist. You think God's going to say, hey, you know, Dr. Loechelt was not a Bible literalist, therefore he's not saved? No, because then you're basing it upon, you know, being a literalist rather than on the sacrifice that Christ made, which would be generally what would be understood for a Christian, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is the heart of the gospel, right? The death, resurrection of Christ.
I accept that is the gospel message. Right.
What's that?
Even as a non-believer, I would accept that is a core component to Christianity, which would be accepting the divinity of Christ, especially for John 3:16. It would not be John 3:16 plus, oh, the earth is only 7,000 years old, but they make it almost like a salvational issue.
Yeah.
As Kevin notes,
just one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, one observation is it has a lot of influence. I think there's a lot to a person's upbringing and how they came to Christ. I've seen that. A good example is Tom Cruise, because I've had a dialogue with him, and we've shared our testimonies. And he basically said he grew up as an atheist and was, as you know, an atheist for a period of time, and then talks about how he came to Christ. And it was through a church that had embraced young Earth creationism. Mm-hmm. So his salvation experience and his embracing of young Earth creation kind of came together in the same package. And maybe not exactly at the same time, but like within a year or so. I mean, he was a young Christian when he really sort of embraced fully the young Earth creationism. And so it's like that to him was so tied to his salvation experience. I think he has a hard time even understanding how it could be separate.
Yeah, you might be right on that. Kevin notes that's why young Earth creationism invoked accelerated radioactive decay, which you have a paper out there published in a reputable journal. And by the way, thank you very much. You did put me in the acknowledgement as somebody who facilitates these things, and I was honored by that. So thank you so much for that. You have no idea what that meant to me.
Well, I'm glad it meant a lot.
Yeah, and I love the paper. Which again, maybe another time we'll reinvigorate people on that particular topic. But because it's not a dead issue, by the way, it's far from a dead issue. It is to us who basically know, hey, the young creationism model's wrong on these things. But I still get a scene, brought up occasionally. Like the radiometric halos is coming around again, so it's just a matter of time before helium diffusion rates start coming again. As you said, they cycle through these things.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the Halo thing, I saw your presentation. I have some of my own material on it. I have some interesting
I
ideas
don't think I
that
did too
you
bad. As you said, I'm a late.
oh
I
no,
mean,
you did
I got
really good.
my background's in
I
nuclear reactors, but I think I remembered enough to do a decent presentation on the Halos to explain why they were wrong.
yeah, I think from what I recall from your presentation, it was like a very good tutorial. I mean,
Yes,
it was very good covering the fundamentals.
that's
But
all I'm
I
supposed to
think
do. The basics. Yeah.
well, which is good. The thing, and this is my this is my personal interpretation of all the rate halo data stuff, just looking carefully at Snelling's work. And by the way, out of all the rate studies, I have the highest regard for his for the radio halo work. I think that was the one study that's really top notch. Just the sheer number of samples that
They really did.
Dr.
They
Snelling,
they really did.
it was mind blowing. I mean, this is one of those things that just the quantity of data alone would could be publishable
Because
in
they
the
really wanted
academic
that to
journal
be. They wanted that. They really
because
wanted it to
it
be
was
supportive of
it
younger
was a better
creationism.
study than anything I've seen in the literature as far as the thoroughness and the completeness. But he points out very clearly, and this is, and he actually contradicts Gentry, who believes that they were ab initio creation things.
Hmm.
Snelling takes the view that there's a genetic relationship between uranium halos and these polonium halos. And very convincing evidence. He said sometimes he finds the same two between the same sheet of biotype because he peeled things off layer by layer. That look, there's a genetic relationship, and the best way to explain that is the transport of a radiogenic product from the uranium halo to the center of the polonium halo.
Correct. Right.
And
Uranium
and I totally agree with that.
222 through hydrologic.
Uh,
Yeah.
what's that?
Yeah. That's basically what would be radon 222 through
Exactly.
microfissions and and hydrological transport. Yeah.
Yeah, and then this is the part that blows my mind. It's like you look at all the decay products from uranium. It starts uranium, a heavy a heavy metal, right?
Hmm.
Lanthanide metal, radium, heavy metal, radon, noble gas. And then you go down. It's like which one is going to be the mobile species?
Hmm.
What's going to be the
Yes.
radon?
Radon. Yeah.
Right?
And
I mean,
they also have a major problem because, as you well know, alpha particles. That's governed by the strong nuclear force, which is not going to be dependent on temperature or pressure or anything that the flood model has, because they want the flood to posit this accelerated nuclear decay. Well, that's not going to work for something that's governed by the strong nuclear force. It's not going to have any
no,
effect on it whatsoever.
no, no.
Yeah.
But you see, the radon is your likely mobile species because it is highly mobile.
Yes.
I mean, find it in houses. I have a paper more like a radiation safety one I remember seeing that showed how even just the anchor bolts in the foundation radon can just wind its way up and enter to a basement or something from that. So radon's a mobile species. Um, but they believe that was polonium, and then he says, well, it has to be hydrothermal, and then it has to be this narrow temperature. It's this elaborate argument of
Yeah,
how you get the
but
polonium.
it's
Uh,
not simplistic as the radon diffusion.
and but it's like, well, but radon is your most likely mobile species.
Clearly. That's why I
Really,
think Gentry gave up
like,
on it. During his later days, Gentry just basically said these are
yeah,
singularities, one-off events that God does these little minor miracles, because I think
yeah,
he knew there was a naturalistic explanation for it, but he didn't want to see his entire life work, so to speak, just kind of like pooped
yeah,
upon. Because once they
yeah,
determined how this actually happens, then didn't become so mysterious. And even though he didn't
yeah,
initially argue that it was actually young Earth creationist evidence, he basically argued that it showed evidence of a rapidly cooled Earth within several weeks, which of
yeah.
course wouldn't happen in deep time. But anyways, let's start wrapping this up. This was great. This was a great presentation, and I appreciate it immensely. Anything you want to share to the audience before we kind of call it to a close?
I don't know. Or did you get any kind of questions or comments in the chat that we want
No,
to
there are
talk
not any
about?
questions. There's a lot of statements.
Any
Basically,
good statements that's worth sharing? I'm kind of curious what the audience thought of this.
let's see. Tim says Janet Kellogg Ray was writing a book on why Christians are afraid to give up on young Earth creationism. Should be an interesting one. That would be something I would definitely read, about why they find it so untenable to give up on young Earth creationism, even though, like I said, Wayne Fillmore, he left Young Earth Creationism.
Yeah.
I know a lot of old Earth creationists that used to be Young Earth Creationists. Kevin says, excellent job, Gary and Steve. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate all that you've done. If you guys want to check out Kevin's work, he wrote something on Talk Origins, or at least a supplemental for Talk Origins on helium diffusion rates, which is excellent. So if anybody ever hears that argument, then Dr. Hinke is definitely the person to go to on that particular argument. And Gary, Dr. Loechelt, on his article that he wrote called something about, I don't remember the exact title, but it's basically accelerated nuclear decay and why it's not a thing.
Yeah. In light of new experimental evidence, I tried to bring in
but
more evidence. Like I said, that a lot of the Young Earth creation stuff is state of start, and as a scientist, the thing I learned right away was you have to acquire more data. You need to read more papers. You need to really educate yourself to understand these things, because they will present little tiny bits of truth that they will selectively present the information that supports their conclusion.
That is exactly
and
the case. I have seen
very
that
selective.
Very thing. So Tim says,
but you counteract that by just educating yourself. It's like everything, where it was the selective information. Like Humphrey's magnetic field decay theory. Well, I go off and buy a book on seriously. I'll buy on my library. I have a couple of books on the geomagnetic field and everything. So I'll read up on it. It's like, okay, I see how the selective use of information is being used now that I've educated myself to the broad spectrum of what's out there.
And that's what you have to do, because exactly the case, they'll selectively give information. Like when I see people bring up something like radiometric halos or helium diffusion rates, and I think to myself, I don't think that person's probably dived too deep into it, knowing what I know about it now because I've dived deep in it with you guys. Yet they don't put out much information on it. They just basically rely. Oh, here's this PhD that works for Answers in Genesis. They're saying this. But when you question them on it, they don't really have any answers because they don't know the topic that detailed. We have the same thing with Tompkins when we're talking about the human chromosome fusion site, and that he argues like the DDX11L2 gene is highly expressed when it's not. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. They're very selective in what they put out to the Young Earth creationists, and I'm looking forward to that book that Janet Kellogg-Ray is writing on why Christians are afraid to give up on Young Earth creationists. It goes. I'm just curious on that. So, anyways, Dr. Schelt, thank you again for everything, your support, and
you're very welcome.
And Dr. Hinke's support of my channel has been, nothing but amazing, and I love the fact that we've kept in touch and been friends for several years now. And I appreciate it very much. So.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Well, the feeling's mutual.
Thank you guys for watching. If you guys have any questions, leave it in the comments in the comment section, and I will make sure that I'll get to the appropriate people to find the answers for it. But with that, good night, everyone. Thank you for watching the Non-Sequitur Show. Like, subscribe, and all that stuff for YouTube stuff, even though I don't do much with the show anymore. I'm still trying, and I think it's great that we have people like Dr. Schelt who's willing to come in with these types of presentations. So if you want to have a presentation, just let me know. I'll make it happen. With that, good night, guys.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.